Chapter 14 of 20 Years at Hull House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Double Mirrors. 20 Years at Hull House by Jane Addams. Chapter 14. Civic Cooperation. One of the first lessons we learned at Hull House was that private beneficence is totally inadequate to deal with the vast numbers of the city's disinherited. We also quickly came to realize that there are certain types of wretchedness from which every private philanthropy shrinks, and which are cared for only in those wards of the county hospital provided for the wrecks of vicious living, or in the city's isolation hospital for smallpox patients. I have heard a broken-hearted mother exclaim when her erring daughter came home, at last too broken and too diseased to be taken into the family she had disgraced, "There is no place for her but the top floor of the county hospital. They will have to take her there." And this was only after every possible expedient had been tried or suggested. This aspect of governmental responsibility was unforgettably borne in upon me during the smallpox epidemic during the World's Fair, when one of the residents, Mrs. Kelly, as state factory inspector, was much concerned in discovering and destroying clothing which had been finished in houses containing unreported cases of smallpox. The duty most successful in locating such cases lived at Hull House during the epidemic because he did not wish to expose his own family. Another resident, Miss Lathrop, as a member of the State Board of Charities, went back and forth to the crowded pest house which had been hastily constructed on a stretch of prairie west of the city. As Hull House was already so exposed, it seemed best for the smallpox inspectors from the Board of Health to take their meals and change their clothing there before they went to their respective homes. All of these officials had accepted without question, and as implicit in public office, the obligation to carry on the dangerous and difficult undertakings for which private philanthropy is unfitted, as if the commonality of compassion represented by the state was much more comprehending than that of any individual group. It was as early as our second winter on Halstead Street that one of the Hull House residents received an appointment from the Cook County agent as a county advisor. She reported at the agency each morning, and all the cases within a radius of 10 blocks from Hull House were given to her for investigation. This gave her a legitimate opportunity for knowing the poorest people in the neighbourhood, and also for understanding the county method of outdoor relief. The commissioners were at first dubious of the value of such a visitor, and predicted that a woman would be a perfect coal chute for giving away county supplies, but they gradually came to depend on her suggestion and advice. In 1893, this same resident, Miss Julia C. Lathrop, was appointed by the governor a member of the Illinois State Board of Charities. She served in this capacity for 2 consecutive terms and was later reappointed to a 3rd term. Perhaps her most valuable contribution towards the enlargement and reorganization of the charitable institutions of the state came through her intimate knowledge of the beneficiaries, and her experience demonstrated that it is only through residence among the poor that an official could have learned to view public institutions as she did, from the standpoint of the inmates rather than that of the managers. Since that early day, residents of Hull House have spent much time in working for the civil service methods of appointment for employees in the country and state institutions, for the establishment of state colonies, for the care of epileptics, and for a dozen other enterprises which occupy that borderland between charitable effort and legislation. In this borderland we cooperate in many civic enterprises, for I think that we may claim that Hull House has always held its activities highly, ready to hand them over to whomsoever could carry them on properly. Miss Starr had early made a collection of framed photographs, largely of the paintings studied in her art class, which became the basis of a loan collection first used by the Hull House students and later extended to the public schools. It may be fair to suggest that this effort was the nucleus of the Public School Art Society, which was later formed in the city and of which Miss Starr was the first president. In our 2 summers we had maintained 3 baths in the basement of our own house for the use of the neighborhood, and they afforded some experience and argument for the erection of the first public bathhouse in Chicago, which was built on a neighboring street and opened under the City Board of Health. The lot upon which it was erected belonged to a friend of Hull House, who offered it to the city without rent, and this enabled the city to erect the first bath from the small appropriation of $10,000. Great fear was expressed by the public authorities that the baths would not be used, and the old story of the bathtubs in model tenements which had been turned into coal bins was often quoted to us. We were supplied, however, with the incontrovertible arguments that in our adjacent third square mile there were in 1892 but 3 bathtubs, and that this fact was much complained of by many of the tenement house dwellers. Our contention was justified by the immediate and overflowing use of the public baths, as we had before been sustained in the contention that an immigrant population would respond to opportunities for reading when the Public Library Board had established a branch reading room at Hull House. We also quickly discovered that nothing brought us so absolutely into comradeship with our neighbours as mutual and sustained effort, such as the paving of a street, the closing of a gambling house, or the restoration of a veteran police sergeant. Several of these earlier attempts at civic cooperation were undertaken in connection with the Hull House Men's Club, which had been organised in the spring of 1893, had been incorporated under a state charter of its own, and had occupied a club room in the gymnasium building. This club obtained an early success in one of the political struggles in the ward, and thus fastened upon itself a spacious reputation for political power. It was at last so torn by the dissensions of 2 political factions which attempted to capture it that, although it is still an existing organisation, it has never regained the prestige of its first 5 years. Its early political success came in a campaign Hull House had instigated against a powerful alderman who had held office for more than 20 years in the 19th Ward, and who, although notoriously corrupt, is still firmly entrenched among his constituents. Hull House has had to do with 3 campaigns organised against him. In the first one he was apparently only amused at our Sunday school effort, and did little to oppose the election to the aldermanic office of a member of the Hull House Men's Club, who thus became his colleague in the City Council. When Hull House, however, made an effort in the following spring against the re-election of the alderman himself, we encountered the most determined and skilful opposition. In these campaigns we doubtless depended too much on the idealistic appeal, for we did not yet comprehend the element of reality always brought into the political struggle in such a neighbourhood where politics deals so directly with getting a job and earning a living. We soon discovered that approximately 1 out of every 5 voters in the 19th Ward at the time held a job dependent upon the goodwill of the alderman. There were no civil service rules to interfere, and the unskilled voter swept the street and dug the sewer, as secure in his position as the most sophisticated voter who tended a bridge or occupied an office chair in the City Hall. The alderman was even more fortunate in finding places with the franchise-seeking corporations. It took us some time to understand why so large a proportion of our neighbours were streetcar employees, and why we had such a large club composed solely of telephone girls. Our powerful alderman had various methods of entrenching himself. Many people were indebted to him for his kindly services in the police station and the justice courts, for in those days Irish constituents easily broke the peace, and before the establishment of the juvenile court, boys were arrested for very trivial offences. Added to those were hundreds of constituents indebted to him for personal kindness, from the peddler who received a free licence to the businessman who had a railroad pass to New York. Our third campaign against him, when we succeeded in making a serious impression upon his majority, invoked from his henchmen the same sort of hostility which a striker so inevitably feels against the man who would take his job, even sharpened by the sense that the movement for reform came from an alien source. Another result of the campaign was an expectation on the part of our new political friends that Hull House would perform like offices for them, and there resulted endless confusion and misunderstanding, because in many cases we could not even attempt to do what the alderman constantly did with a right good will. When he protected a lawbreaker from the legal consequences of his act, his kindness appeared, not only to himself, but to all beholders, like the deed of a powerful and kindly statesman. When Hull House, on the other hand, insisted that a law must be enforced, it could but appear like persecution of the offender. We were certainly not anxious for consistency, nor for individual achievement, but in a desire to foster a higher political morality, and not to lower our standards, we constantly clashed with the existing political code. We also unwittingly stumbled upon a powerful combination, of which our alderman was the political head, with its banking, its ecclesiastical, and its journalistic representatives. And as we followed up the clue and naively told all we discovered, we of course laid the foundations for opposition which had manifested itself in many forms. The most striking expression of it was an attack upon Hull House lasting through weeks and months by a Chicago daily newspaper which has since ceased publication. During the third campaign I received many anonymous letters, those from the men often obscene, those from the women revealing that curious connection between prostitution and the lowest type of politics which every city tries in vain to hide. I had offers from the men in the city prison to vote properly if released, various communications from lodging house keepers as to the prices of the vote they were ready to deliver. Everywhere appeared that animosity which is invoked only when a man feels that his means of livelihood is threatened. As I look back, I am reminded of the state of mind Kipling's newspaperman, who witnessed a volcanic eruption at sea, in which unbelievable deep-sea creatures were expelled to the surface, among them an enormous white serpent, blind and smelling of musk, whose death throes thrashed the sea into a fury. With professional instinct unimpaired, the journalists carefully observed the uncanny creature never designed for the eyes of men. But a few days later, when they found themselves in a comfortable second-class carriage, travelling from Southampton to London, between trim hedgerows and smug English villages, they concluded that the experience was too sensational to be put before the British public, and it became improbable even to themselves. Many subsequent years of living in kindly neighbourhood fashion with the people of the 19th Ward has produced upon my memory the soothing effect of the second-class railroad carriage, and many of these political experiences have not only become remote, but already seem improbable. On the other hand, these campaigns were not without their reward. One of them was a quickened friendship both with the most substantial citizens in the ward and with a group of fine young voters whose devotion to Hull House has never since failed. Another was a sense of identification with the public-spirited men throughout the city who contributed money and time to what they considered a gallant effort against political corruption. I remember a young professor from the University of Chicago who with his wife came to live at Hull House, travelling the long distance every day throughout the autumn and winter that he might qualify as a 19th Ward voter in the spring campaign. He served as a watcher at the polls, and it was but a poor reward for his devotion that he was literally set upon and beaten up, for in those good old days such things frequently occurred. Many another case of devotion to our standards so recklessly raised might be cited, but perhaps more valuable than any of these was the sense of identification we obtained with the rest of Chicago. So far as settlement can discern and bring to local consciousness neighbourhood needs which are common needs, and can give vigorous help to the municipal measures through which such needs shall be met, it fulfills its most valuable function. To illustrate from our first effort to improve the street paving in the vicinity, we found that we had secured the consent of the majority of the property owners on a given street for new paving. The alderman checked the entire plan through his kindly service to one man who had appealed to him to keep the assessments down. The street long remained a shocking mass of wet, dilapidated cedar blocks, where children were sometimes mired as they floated a surviving block in the water, which speedily filled the holes whence other blocks had been extracted for fuel. And yet, when we were able to demonstrate that the street paving had thus been reduced into cedar pulp by the heavily loaded wagons of an adjacent factory, that the expense of its repaving should be borne from a general fund and not by the poor property owners, we found that we could unite in advocating reform in the method of repaving assessments, and the alderman himself was obliged to come into such a popular movement. The 19th Ward Improvement Association, which met at Hull House during 2 winters, was the first body of citizens able to make a real impression upon the local paving situation. They secured an expert to watch the paving as it went down, to be sure that their half of the paving money was well expended. In the belief that property values would thus be enhanced, the common aim brought together the most prosperous people of the vicinity, somewhat as the Hull House Cooperative Coal Association brought together the poorer ones. I remember that during the second campaign against our alderman, Governor Pingree of Michigan came to visit Hull House. He said that the stronghold of such a man was not the place in which to start municipal regeneration, that good aldermen should be elected from the promising wards first, until a majority of honest men in the city council should make politics unprofitable for corrupt men. We replied that it was difficult to divide Chicago into good and bad wards, but that a new organization called the Municipal Voters League was attempting to give to the well-meaning voter in each ward throughout the city accurate information concerning the candidates and their relation, past and present, to vital issues. One of our trustees, who was most active in inaugurating this league, always said that his 19th Ward experience had convinced him of the unity of city politics, and that he constantly used our campaign as a challenge to the unaroused citizens living in the wards less conspicuously corrupt. Certainly the need for civic cooperation was obvious in many directions, and in none more striking than in that organised effort which must be carried on unceasingly if young people are to be protected from the darker and coarser dangers of the city. The cooperation between Hull House and the Juvenile Protective Association came about gradually, and it seems now almost inevitably. From the earliest days we saw many boys constantly arrested, and I had a number of most enlightening experiences in the police station with an Irish lad whose mother upon her deathbed had begged me to look after him. We were distressed by the gangs of very little boys who would sally forth with an enterprising leader in search of old brass and iron, sometimes breaking into empty houses for the sake of the faucets or lead pipe, which they would sell for a good price to a junk dealer. With the money thus obtained they would buy cigarettes and beer, or even candy, which could be conspicuously consumed in alleys where they might enjoy the excitement of being seen and suspected by the coppers. From the 3rd year of Hull House, one of the residents had a semi-official position in the nearest police station. At least the sergeant agreed to give her provisional charge of every boy and girl under arrest for any trivial offence. Mrs. Stevens, who performed this work for several years, became the first probation officer of the juvenile court when it was established in Cook County in 1899. She was the sole probation officer at first, but at the time of her death, which occurred at Hull House in 1900, she was the senior officer of a corps of 6. Her entire experience had fitted her to deal wisely with wayward children. She had gone into a New England cotton mill at the age of 13, where she had promptly lost the index finger on her right hand, through carelessness, she was told, and no one then seemed to understand that freedom from care was the prerogative of childhood. Later she became a typesetter and was one of the first women in America to become a member of the Typographical Union, retaining her card through all the later years of editorial work. As the juvenile court developed, the Committee of Public-Spirited Citizens, who first supplied only Mrs. Stevens' salary, later maintained a corps of 22 such officers. Several of these were Hull House residents, who brought to the house for many years a sad little procession of children, struggling against all sorts of handicaps. When legislation was secured which placed the probation officers upon the payroll of the county, it was a challenge to the efficiency of the civil service method of appointment to obtain by examination men and women fit for this delicate human task. As one of 5 people asked by the Civil Service Commission to conduct this first examination for probation officers, I became convinced that we were but at the beginning of the non-political method of selecting public servants. But even stiff and unbending as the examination may be, it is still our hope of political salvation. In 1907, the juvenile court was housed in a model court building of its own, containing a detention home and equipped with competent staff. The committee of citizens largely responsible for this result thereupon turned their attention to the conditions which the record of the court indicated had led to the alarming amount of juvenile delinquency and crime. They organised the Juvenile Protective Association, whose 22 officers met weekly at Hull House with their executive committee to report what they have found and to discuss city conditions affecting the lives of children and young people. The association discovers that there are certain temptations into which children so habitually fall that it is evident that the average child cannot withstand them. An overwhelming mass of data is accumulated showing the need of enforcing existing legislation and of securing new legislation, but it also indicates 100 other directions in which the young people who so gaily walk our streets, often to their own destruction, need safeguarding and protection. The effort of the association to treat the youth of the city with consideration and understanding has rallied the most unexpected forces to its standard. Quite as the basic needs of life are supplied solely by those who make money out of the business, so the modern city has assumed that the craving for pleasure must be ministered to only by the sordid. This assumption, however, in a large measure broke down as soon as the Juvenile Protective Association courageously put it to the test. After persistent prosecutions, but also after many friendly interviews, the Druggists Association itself prosecutes those of its members who sell indecent postal cards. The Saloon Keepers Protective Association not only declines to protect members who sell liquor to minors, but now takes drastic action to prevent such sales. The Retail Grocers Association forbids the selling of tobacco to minors. The Association of Department Store Managers not only increased the vigilance in their waiting rooms by supplying more matrons, but as a body they have become regular contributors to the association. The special watchmen in all the railroad yards agree not to arrest trespassing boys, but to report them to the association. The firms manufacturing moving picture films not only submit their films to a volunteer inspection committee, but ask for suggestions in regard to new matter. And the 5-cent theatres arrange for stunts, which shall deal with the subject of public health and morals, when the lecturers provided are entertaining as well as instructive. It is not difficult to arouse the impulse of protection for the young, which would doubtless dictate the daily acts of many a bartender and a poolroom keeper, if they could only indulge it without giving their rivals an advantage. When this difficulty is removed by an even-handed enforcement of the law, that simple kindliness which the innocent always invoke goes from one to another like a slowly spreading flame of goodwill. Doubtless the most rewarding experience in any such undertaking as that of the Juvenile Protective Association is the warm and intelligent cooperation coming from unexpected sources, official and commercial as well as philanthropic. Upon the suggestion of the association, social centres have been opened in various parts of the city, disused buildings turned into recreation rooms, vacant lots made into gardens, hiking parties organised for country excursions, bathing beaches established on the lakefront, and public schools opened for social purposes. Through the efforts of public-spirited citizens, a medical clinic and a psychopathic institute have become associated with the Juvenile Court of Chicago, in addition to which an exhaustive study of court records has been completed. To this carefully collected data concerning the abnormal child, the Juvenile Protective Association hoped in time to add knowledge of the normal child who lives under the most adverse city conditions. It was not without hope that I might be able to forward in the public school system the solution of some of these problems of delinquency so dependent upon truancy and ill-adapted education that I became a member of the Chicago Board of Education in July 1905. It is impossible to write of the situation as it became dramatized in a half a dozen strong personalities, but the entire experience was so illuminating as to the difficulties and limitations of democratic government that it would be unfair in a chapter on civic coordination not to attempt an outline. Even the briefest statement, however, necessitates a review of the preceding few years. For a decade, the Chicago school teachers, or rather a majority of them who were organized into the Teachers' Federation, had been engaged in a conflict with the Board of Education, both for the more adequate salaries and for more self-direction in the conduct of the schools. In pursuance of the first object, they had attacked the tax dodger along the entire lines of his defence, from the curbstone to the Supreme Court. They began with an intricate investigation which uncovered the fact that in 1899, $235 million of value of public unity corporations paid nothing in taxes. The Teachers' Federation brought a suit which was prosecuted through the Supreme Court of Illinois and resulted in an order entered against the State Board of Equalization, demanding that it tax the corporations mentioned in the bill in spite of the fact that the defendant companies sought federal aid and obtained an order which restrained the payment of a portion of the tax each year since 1900. The Chicago Board of Education has benefited to the extent of more than $250,000. Although this result had been attained through the unaided efforts of the teachers, to their surprise and indignation, their salaries were not increased. The Teachers' Federation therefore brought a suit against the Board of Education for the advance which had been promised them 3 years earlier but never paid. The decision of the lower court was in their favour, but the Board of Education appealed the case, and this was the situation with the 7 new members appointed by Mayor June in 1905 took their seats. The Conservative public suspected that these new members were merely representatives of the Teachers' Federation. This opinion was founded upon the fact that Judge Doone had rendered a favourable decision in the teachers' suit, and that the teachers had been very active in the campaign which had resulted in his election as mayor of the city. It seemed obvious that the teachers had entered into politics for the sake of securing their own representatives on the Board of Education. These suspicions were, of course, only confirmed when the new board voted to withdraw the suit of their predecessors from the appellate court and to act upon the decision of the lower court. The teachers, on the other hand, defended their long efforts in the courts, the State Board of Equalization, and the legislature against the charge of dragging the schools into politics, and declared that the exposure of the indifference and cupidity of the politicians was a well-deserved rebuke, and that it was the politicians who had brought the school to the verge of financial ruin. They further insisted that the levy and collection of taxes, tenure of office, and pensions to civil servants in Chicago were all entangled with the traction situation, which in their minds had at least come to be an example of the struggle between the democratic and plutocratic administration of city affairs. The new appointees to the school board represented no concerted policy of any kind, but were for the most part adherents to the new education. The teachers, confident that their cause was identical with the principles advocated by such educators as Colonel Parker, were therefore sure that their plans of the new education members would of necessity coincide with the plans of the Teachers' Federation. In one sense, the situation was an epitome of Mayor June's entire administration, which was founded upon the belief that if those citizens representing social ideas and reform principles were but appointed to office, public welfare must be established. During my tenure of office, I many times talked to the officers of the Teachers' Federation, but I was seldom able to follow their suggestions, and although I gladly cooperated in their plans for a better pension system and other matters, only once did I try to influence the policy of the Federation. When the withheld salaries were finally paid to the representatives of the Federation who had brought suit and were divided among the members who had suffered both financially and professionally during this long legal struggle, I was most anxious that the division should voluntarily be extended to all of the teachers who had experienced a loss of salary although they were not members of the Federation. It seemed to me a striking opportunity to refute the charge that the Federation was self-seeking and to put the whole long effort in the minds of the public exactly where it belonged, as one of devoted public service. But it was doubtless much easier for me to urge this altruistic policy than it was for those who had borne the heat and the burden of the day to act upon it. The second object of the Teachers' Federation also entailed much stress and storm. At the time of the financial stringency, and largely as a result of it, the board had made the first substantial advance in a teacher's salary dependent upon a so-called promotional examination, half of which was upon academic subjects entailing a long and severe preparation. The teachers resented this upon two lines of argument. First, that the scheme was unprofessional in that the teacher was advanced on her capacity as a student rather than on her professional ability, and second, that it added an intolerable and unnecessary burden to her already overfull day. The administration, on the other hand, contended with much justice that there was a constant danger in the great public school system that teachers lose pliancy and the open mind, and that many of them had obviously grown mechanical and indifferent. The Conservative public approved the promotional examinations as the symbol of an advancing educational standard, and their sympathy with the superintendent was increased because they continually resented the affiliation of the Teachers' Federation with the Chicago Federation of Labor, which had taken place several years before the election of Mayor June on his traction platform. This much talked of affiliation between the teachers and the trade unionists had been, at least in the first instance, but one more tactic in the long struggle against the tax-dodging corporations. The Teachers' Federation had won in their first skirmish against the public indifference, which is generated in the accumulation of wealth, and which has for its nucleus successful commercial men. When they found themselves in need of further legislation to keep the offending corporations under control, they naturally turned for political influence and votes to the organisation representing working men. The affiliation had none of the sinister meanings so often attached to it. The Teachers' Federation never obtained a charter from the American Federation of Labour, and its main interest always centred in the Legislative Committee. And yet this statement of the difference between the majority of the grade school teachers and the Chicago School Board is totally inadequate, for the difficulties were stubborn and lay far back in the long efforts of public school administration in America to free itself from the rule and exploitation of politics. In every city for many years the politician had secured positions for his friends as teachers and janitors. He had received a rake-off in the contract for every new building or coal supply or adoption of school books. In the long struggle against the political corruption, the one remedy continually advocated was the transfer of authority in all educational matters from the board to the superintendent. The one cure for pull and corruption was the authority of the expert. The rules and records of the Chicago Board of Education are full of relics of this long struggle honestly waged by honest men, who unfortunately became content with the ideals of an efficient business administration. These businessmen established an able superintendent with a large salary, with his tenure of office secured by state law so that he would not be disturbed by the wrath of the balked politician. They instituted impersonal examinations for the teachers, both as to entrance into the system and promotion, and they proceeded to hold the superintendent responsible for smooth running schools. All of this, however, dangerously approximated the commercialistic ideas of high salaries only for the management with the final test of a small expense account and a large output. In this long struggle for a quarter of a century to free the public schools from political interference, in Chicago at least, the high wall defence erected around the school system in order to keep the rascals out unfortunately so restricted the teachers inside the system that they had no space in which to move about freely, and the more adventurous of them fairly panted for light and air. Any attempt to lower the wall for the sake of the teachers within was regarded as giving an opportunity to the politicians without, and they were often openly accused, with a show of truth, of being in league with each other. Whenever the June members of the board attempted to secure more liberty for the teachers, we were warned by tales of former difficulties with the politicians, and it seemed impossible that the struggle, so long the focus of attention, should recede into the dullness of the achieved and allow the energy of the board to be free for new effort. The whole situation between the superintendents supported by a majority of the board and the Teachers' Federation had become an epitome of the struggle between efficiency and democracy. On one side, a well-intentioned expression of the bureaucracy necessary in a large system, but which under pressure had become unnecessarily self-assertive, and on the other side a fairly militant demand for self-government made in the name of freedom. Both sides inevitably exaggerated the difficulties of the situation, and both felt that they were standing by important principles. I certainly played a most inglorious part in the unnecessary conflict. I was chairman of the school management committee during one year when a majority of members seemed to me exasperatingly conservative, and during another year when they were frustratingly radical, and I was of course highly unsatisfactory to both. Certainly a plan to retain the undoubted benefit of required study for teachers in such wise as to lessen its burden, and various schemes devised to shift the emphasis from scholarship to professional work, were most impatiently repudiated by the Teachers' Federation, and when one badly mutilated plan finally passed the board, it was most reluctantly administered by the superintendent. I at least became convinced that partisans would never tolerate the use of stepping stones. They are much too impatient to look on while their beloved scheme is unstably balanced, and they would rather see it tumble into the stream at once than to have it brought to dry land in any such half-hearted fashion. Before my school board experience, I thought that life had taught me at least one hard-earned lesson: that existing arrangements and the hope for improvements must be mediated and reconciled to each other, and that the new must be dovetailed into the old, as it were, if it were to endure. But on the school board I discerned that all such efforts were looked upon as compromising and unworthy by both partisans. In the general disorder and public excitement resulting from the illegal dismissal of a majority of the June board and their reinstatement by a court decision, I found myself belonging to neither party. During the months following the upheaval and the loss of my most vigorous colleagues under the regime of men representing the leading commercial club of the city who honestly believed that they were rescuing the schools from a condition of chaos, I saw one beloved measure after another withdrawn. Although the new president scrupulously gave me the floor in defence of each, it was impossible to consider them upon their merits in the lurid light which at the moment enveloped all of the plans of the uplifters. Thus the building of smaller schoolrooms, such as in New York mechanically avoid overcrowding, the extension of the truant rooms so successfully inaugurated, the multiplication of school playgrounds, and many another cherished plan was thrown out, or at least indefinitely postponed. The final discrediting of Mayor June's appointees to the school board affords a very interesting study in social psychology. The newspapers had so constantly reflected and intensified the ideals of a business board, and had so persistently ridiculed various administration plans for the municipal ownership of street railways, that from the beginning any attempts the new board made to discuss educational matters only excited their derision and contempt. Some of these discussions were lengthy and disorderly, and deserved the discipline of ridicule, but others which were well conducted and in which educational problems were seriously set forth by men of authority were ridiculed quite as sharply. I recall the surprise and indignation of a university professor who had consented to speak at a meeting arranged in the boardrooms, when next morning his non-partisan and careful disquisition had been twisted into the most arrant uplift nonsense, and so connected with a fake newspaper report of a trial marriage address delivered, not by himself but by a colleague, that a leading clergyman of the board, having read the newspaper account, felt impelled to preach a sermon calling upon all decent people to rally against the doctrines which were being taught to the children by an immoral school board. As the bewildered professor had lectured in response to my invitation, I endeavoured to find the animus of the complication, but neither from editor-in-chief nor from the reporter could I discover anything more sinister than the public expected a good story out of these school board talk fests, and that any man who even momentarily allied himself with a radical administration must expect to be ridiculed by those papers which considered the traction policy of the administration both foolish and dangerous. As I myself was treated with uniform courtesy by the leading papers, I may perhaps here record my discouragement over the complicated necessity of open discussion. For democratic government is founded upon the assumption that differing policies shall be freely discussed, and that each party shall have an opportunity for at least a partisan presentation of its contentions. This attitude of the newspapers was doubtless intensified because the June School Board had instituted a lawsuit challenging the validity of the lease for the school ground occupied by a newspaper building. This suit had been decided in favour of the newspaper, and it may be that in their resentment they felt justified in doing everything possible to minimise the prosecuting school board. I am, however, inclined to think that the newspapers but reflected an opinion honestly held by many people, and that their constant and partisan presentation of this opinion clearly demonstrates one of the greatest difficulties of governmental administration in a city grown too large for verbal discussions of public affairs. It is difficult to close this chapter without a reference to the efforts made in Chicago to secure the municipal franchise for women. During 2 long periods of agitation for a new city charter, a representative body of women appealed to the public, to the Charter Convention, and to the Illinois legislature for this very reasonable provision. During the campaign, when I acted as chairman of the Federation of 100 Women's Organizations, nothing impressed me so forcibly as the fact that the response came from bodies of women representing the most varied traditions. We were joined by a church society of hundreds of Lutheran women, because Scandinavian women had exercised the municipal franchise since the 17th century and had found American cities strangely conservative, by organizations of working women who had keenly felt the need of municipal franchise in order to secure for their workshops the most rudimentary sanitation and the consideration which the vote alone obtains for working men, by federations of mothers' meetings who were interested in clean milk and the extension of kindergartens, by property-owning women who had been powerless to protest against unjust taxation, by organizations of professional women, of university students and of collegiate alumni, and by women's clubs interested in municipal reforms. There was a complete absence of the traditional women's rights clamour, but much impressive testimony from busy and useful women that they had reached the place where they needed the franchise in order to carry on their own affairs. A striking witness as to the need of the ballots, even for the women who were restricted to the most primitive and traditional activities, occurred when some Russian women waited upon me to ask whether under the new charter they could vote for covered markets and so get rid of the shocking Chicago grime upon all their food, and when some neighbouring Italian women sent me word that they would certainly vote for public washhouses if they ever had the chance to vote at all. It was all so human, so spontaneous, and so direct that it really seemed as if the time must be ripe for political expression of that public concern on the part of women which had so long been forced to seek indirection. None of these busy women wished to take the place of men, nor to influence them in the direction of men's affairs, but they did seek an opportunity to cooperate directly in civic life through the use of the ballot in regard to their own affairs. A municipal museum which was established in the Chicago Public Library building several years ago, largely through the activity of a group of women who had served as jurors in the departments of social economy, of education, and of sanitation in the World's Fair at St. Louis, showed nothing more clearly than it is impossible to divide any of these departments from the political life of the modern city, which is constantly forced to enlarge the boundary of its activity. End of chapter 14. Recording by Double Mirrors.
Chapter 15 of 20 Years at Hull House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Velwest. 20 Years at Hull House by Jane Addams. Chapter 15, The Value of Social Clubs. From the early days at Hull House, social clubs composed of English-speaking American-born young people grew apace. So eager were they for social life that no mistakes in management could drive them away. I remember one enthusiastic leader who read aloud to a club a translation of Antigone, which she had selected because she believed that the great themes of the Greek poets were best suited to young people. She came into the club one evening in time to hear the president call the restive members to order with the statement, "You might just as well keep quiet, for she is bound to finish it, and the quicker she gets to reading, the longer time we'll have for dancing." And yet the same club leader had the pleasure of lending 4 copies of the drama to 4 of the members, and one young man almost literally committed the entire play to memory. On the whole, we were much impressed by the great desire for self-improvement, for study and debate, exhibited by many of the young men. This very tendency, in fact, brought one of the most promising of our earlier clubs to an untimely end. The young men in the club, 20 in number, had grown much irritated by the frivolity of the girls during their long debates, and finally proposed that 3 of the most frivolous be expelled. Pending a final vote, the 3 culprits appealed to certain of their friends who were members of the Hull House Men's Club, between whom and the debating young men the incident became the cause of a quarrel so bitter that at length it led to a shooting. Fortunately the shot missed fire, or it may have been true that it was only intended for a scare. But at any rate, we were all thoroughly frightened by this manifestation of the hot blood which the defense of woman has so often evoked. After many efforts to bring about a reconciliation, the debating club of 20 young men and 17 young women, who either were or pretended to be sober-minded, rented a hall a mile west of Hull House, severing their connection with us, because their ambitious and right-minded efforts had been unappreciated, basing this on the ground that we had not urged the expulsion of the so-called tough members of the men's club who had been involved in the difficulty. The succeeding club invited me to the first member in their new quarters that I might present to them my version of the situation and set forth the incident from the standpoint of Hull House. The discussion I had with the young people that evening has always remained with me as one of the moments of illumination which life in a settlement so often affords. In response to my position that a desire to avoid all that was tough meant to walk only in the paths of smug self-seeking and personal improvement leading straight into the pit of self-righteousness and petty achievement, and was exactly what the settlement did not stand for. They contended with much justice that ambitious young people were obliged, for their own reputation if not for their own morals, to avoid all connection with that which bordered on the tough, and that it was quite another matter for the Hull House residents who could afford a more generous judgment. It was in vain I urged that life teaches us nothing more inevitably than that right and wrong are most confusingly confounded, that the blackest wrong may be within our own motives, and that at the best, right will not dazzle us with its radiant shining, and can only be found by exerting patience and discrimination. They still maintain their wholesome bourgeois position, which I am now quite ready to admit was most reasonable. Of course, there were many disappointments connected with these clubs, when the rewards of political and commercial life easily drew the members away from the principles advocated in club meetings. One of the young men who had been a shining light in the advocacy of municipal reform deserted in the middle of a reform campaign because he had been offered a lucrative office in the city hall. Another, even after a course of lectures on business morality, worked the club itself to secure orders for custom made clothing from samples of cloth he displayed, although the orders were filled by ready made suits slightly refitted and delivered at double their original price. But nevertheless there was much to cheer us as we gradually became acquainted with the daily living of the vigorous young men and women who filled to overflowing all the social clubs. We have been much impressed during our 20 years by the ready adaptation of city young people to the prosperity arising from their own increased wages or from the commercial success of their families. This quick adaptability is the great gift of the city child, his one reward for the hurried changing life which he has always led. The working girl has a distinct advantage in the task of transforming her whole family into the ways and connections of the prosperous when she works downtown and becomes conversant with the manners and conditions of a cosmopolitan community. Therefore, having lived in a settlement 20 years, I see scores of young people who have successfully established themselves in life. And in my travels in the city and outside, I am constantly cheered by greetings from the rising young lawyer, the scholarly rabbi, the successful teacher, the prosperous young matron buying clothes for blooming children. Don't you remember me? I used to belong to a Hull House club. I once asked one of these young people, a man who held a good position in a Chicago daily, what special thing Hull House had meant to him, and he promptly replied, "It was the first house I had ever been in where books and magazines just lay around as if there were plenty of them in the world. Don't you remember how much I used to read at that little round table at the back of the library?" To have people regard reading as a reasonable occupation changed the whole aspect of life to me, and I began to have confidence in what I could do. Among the young men of the social clubs, a large proportion of the Jewish ones at least, obtain the advantages of a higher education. The parents make every sacrifice to help them through the high school, after which the young men attend universities and professional schools, largely through their own efforts. From time to time they come back to us with their honors thick upon them. I remember one who returned with the prize in oratory from a contest between several Western state universities, proudly testifying that he had obtained his confidence in our Henry Clay Club. Another came back with a degree from Harvard University, saying that he had made up his mind to go there the summer I read Royce's Aspects of Modern Philosophy, with a group of young men who had challenged my scathing remark that Herbert Spencer was not the only man who had ventured a solution of the riddles of the universe. Occasionally one of these learned young folk does not like to be reminded he once lived in our vicinity. But that happens rarely, and for the most part they are loyal to us in much the same spirit they are to their own families and traditions. Sometimes they go further and tell us that the standards of tastes and code of manners which Hull House has enabled them to form has made a very great difference in their perceptions and estimates of the larger world as well as their own reception there. 5 out of one club of 25 young men who held together for 11 years entered the University of Chicago, but although the rest of the club called them the intellectuals, the old friendships still held. In addition to these rising young people given to debate and dramatics, and to the members of the Public School Alumni Association which meet in our rooms, there are hundreds of others who for years have come to Hull House frankly in search of that pleasure and recreation which all young things crave and which those who have spent long hours in a factory or shop demand as a right. For these young people all sorts of pleasure clubs have been cherished, and large dancing clubs have been organized. One supreme gaiety has come to be an annual event of such importance that it is talked of from year to year. For 6 weeks before St. Patrick's Day, A small group of residents put their best powers of invention and construction into preparation for a cotillion which is like a pageant in its gaiety and vigor. The parents sit in the gallery, and the mothers appreciate more than anyone else perhaps the value of this ball to which an invitation is so highly prized. Although their standards of manners may differ wildly from the conventional, they know full well when the companionship of the young people is safe and unsullied. As an illustration of this difference in standard I may instance an early Hull House picnic, arranged by a club of young people who found at the last moment that the club director could not go, and accepted the offer of the mother of one of the club members to take charge of them. When they trooped back in the evening, tired and happy, they displayed a photograph of the group wherein each man's arm was carefully placed about a girl. No feminine waist lacked an arm save that of the proud chaperone, who sat in the middle, smiling upon all. Seeing that the photograph somewhat surprised us, the chaperone stoutly explained, "This may look queer to you, but there wasn't one thing about that picnic that wasn't nice." And her statement was a perfectly truthful one. Although more conventional customs are carefully enforced at our many parties and festivities, and while the dancing classes are as highly prized for the opportunity they afford for enforcing standards as for their ostensible aim, the residents at Hull House, in their efforts to provide opportunities for clean recreation, receive the most valued help from the experienced wisdom of the older women of the neighborhood. Bowen Hall is constantly used for dancing parties with soft drinks established in its foyer. The parties given by the Hull House clubs are by invitation, and the young people themselves carefully maintain their standard of entrance so that the most cautious mother may feel safe when her daughter goes to one of our parties. No club festivity is permitted without the presence of a director. No young man under the influence of liquor is allowed. Certain types of dancing, often innocently started, are strictly prohibited, and above all, early closing is insisted upon. This standardization of pleasure has always seemed an obligation to the residents of Hull House, but we are, I hope, saved from that priggishness which young people so heartily resent by the Mardi Gras dance and other festivities which the residents themselves arrange and successfully carry out. In spite of our belief that the standards of a ball may be almost as valuable to those without as to those within, the residents are constantly concerned for those many young people in the neighborhood who are too hedonistic to submit to the discipline of a dancing class or even to the claim of a pleasure club, but who go about in freebooter fashion to find pleasure wherever it may be cheaply on sale. Such young people, well meaning but impatient of control, become the easy victims of the worst type of public dance halls and of even darker places whose purposes are hidden under music and dancing. We were thoroughly frightened when we learned that during the year which ended last December more than 25,000 young people under the age of 25 passed through juvenile and municipal courts of Chicago, approximately 1 out of every 80 of the entire population, or 1 out of every 52 of those under 25 years of age. One's heart aches for these young people caught by the outside glitter of city gaiety, who make such a feverish attempt to snatch it for themselves. The young people in our clubs are comparatively safe, but many instances come to the knowledge of Hull House residents which make us long for the time when the city, through more small parks, municipal gymnasium and schoolrooms open for recreation, can guard from disaster these young people who walk so carelessly on the edge of the pit. The heedless girls believed if they lived in big houses and possessed pianos and jewelry, the coveted social life would come to them. I know a Bohemian girl who surreptitiously saved her overtime wages until she had enough money to hire for a week a room with a piano in it where young men might come to call, as they could not do in her crowded, untidy home. Of course she had no way of knowing the sort of young men who quickly discover an unprotected girl. Another girl of American parentage who had come to Chicago to seek her fortune found at the end of a year that sorting shipping receipts in a dark corner of a warehouse not only failed to accumulate riches, but did not even bring the attention which her quiet country home afforded. By dint of long sacrifice she had saved $15. With five she bought an imitation sapphire necklace, and the balance she changed into a $10 bill. The evening her pathetic little snare was set, she walked home with one of the clerks in the establishment, told him that she had come into a fortune and was obliged to wear the heirloom necklace to ensure its safety, permitted him to see that she carried $10 in her glove for car fare, and conducted him to a handsome Prairie Avenue residence. There she gaily bade him good bye and ran up the steps, shutting herself in the vestibule from which she did not emerge until the dazzled and bewildered young man had vanished down the street. Then there is the ever recurring difficulty about dress. The insistence of the young to be gaily bedecked, to the utter consternation of the hard-working parents who are paying for a house and a lot. The Polish girl who stole $5 from her employer's till with which to buy a white dress for a church picnic was turned away from home by her indignant father, who replaced the money to save the family honor, but would harbor no thief in a household of growing children who, in spite of the sisters' revolt, continued to be dressed in dark, heavy clothes through all the hot summer. There are a multitude of working girls who for hours carry hair ribbons and jewelry in their pockets or stockings, for they can wear them only during the journey to and from work. Sometimes this desire to take pleasure, to escape into a world of congenial companionship, takes more elaborate forms and often ends disastrously. I recall a charming young girl, the oldest daughter of a respectable German family, who I first saw one spring afternoon issuing from a tall factory. She wore a blue print gown which so deepened the blue of her eyes that Wordsworth's line fairly sung itself: "The pliant harebell swinging in the breeze on some gray rock." I was grimly reminded of that moment a year later, when I heard the tale of this 17-year-old girl who had worked steadily in the same factory for 4 years before she resolved to see life. In order not to arouse her parents' suspicions, she borrowed $30 from one of those loan sharks who require no security from a pretty girl, so that she might start from her home every morning as if to go to work. For 3 weeks she spent the first part of each dearly bought day in a department store, where she lunched and unfortunately made some dubious acquaintances. In the afternoon she established herself in a theater and sat contentedly hour after hour watching the endless vaudeville until the usual time for returning home. At the end of each week she gave her parents her usual wage, but when her $30 was exhausted, it seemed unendurable that she should return to the monotony of the factory. In the light of her newly acquired experience, she had learned that possibility which the city ever holds open to the restless girl. That more such girls do not come to grief is due to those mothers who understand the insatiable demand for a good time. And if all of the mothers did understand, those pathetic statistics which show that 4/5 of all prostitutes are under 20 years of age would be marvelously changed. We are told that the will to live is aroused in each baby by his mother's irresistible desire to play with him, the physiological value of joy that a child is born, and that the high death rate in institutions is increased by the discontented babies whom no one persuades into living. Something of the same sort is necessary in that second birth at adolescence. The young people need affection and understanding, each one for himself, if they are to be induced to live in an inheritance of decorum and safety, and to understand the foundation upon which this orderly world rests. No one comprehends their needs so sympathetically as those mothers who iron the flimsy starched finery of their grown-up daughters late into the night, and who pay for a red velvet parlor set in the installment plan, although the younger children may sadly need new shoes. These mothers apparently understand the sharp demand for social pleasure and do their best to respond to it, although at the same time they constantly minister to all the physical needs of an exigent family of little children. We often come to a realization of the truth of Walt Whitman's statement that one of the surest sources of wisdom is the mother of a large family. It is but natural, perhaps, that the members of the Hull House Women's Club, whose prosperity has given them some leisure and a chance to remove their own families to neighborhoods less full of temptations, should have offered their assistance in our attempt to provide recreation for these restless young people. In many instances, their experience in the club itself has enabled them to perceive these needs. One day a juvenile court officer told me that a women's club member, who has a large family of her own and one boy sufficiently difficult, had undertaken to care for a ward of the juvenile court who lived only a block from her house, and that she had kept him in the path of rectitude for 6 months. In reply to my congratulations upon this successful bit of reform to the club woman herself, she said that she was quite ashamed that she had not undertaken the task earlier, for she had known for years the boy's mother, who scrubbed a downtown office building, leaving home every evening at 5 and returning at 11 during the very time the boy could most easily find opportunities for wrongdoing. She said that her obligation towards this boy had not occurred to her until one day when the club members were making pillowcases for the detention home of the juvenile court. It suddenly seemed perfectly obvious that her share in the salvation of wayward children was to care for this particular boy, and she had asked the juvenile court officer to commit him to her. She invited the boy to her house to supper every day, that she might know just where he was at the crucial moment of twilight, and she adroitly managed to keep him under her own roof for the evening if she did not approve of the plans he had made. She concluded with the remark that it was queer that the sight of the boy himself hadn't appealed to her, but that the suggestion had come to her in such a roundabout way. She was, of course, reflecting upon a common trait in human nature, that we much more easily see the duty at hand when we see it in relation to the social duty of which it is a part. When she knew that an effort was being made throughout all the large cities in the United States to reclaim the wayward boy, to provide him with a reasonable amusement, to give him a chance for growth and development, and when she became ready to take her share in that movement, she suddenly saw the concrete case which she had not recognized before. We are slowly learning that social advance depends quite as much upon an increase in moral sensibility as it does upon a sense of duty, and of this one can cite many illustrations. I was at one time a chairman of the Child Labor Committee in the General Federation of Women's Clubs, which sent out a schedule asking each club in the United States to report as nearly as possible all the working children under 14 living in its vicinity. A Florida club filled out the schedule with an astonishing number of Cuban children who were at work in sugar mills, and the club members registered a complaint that our committee had sent the schedule too late, for if they had realized the conditions earlier, they might have presented a bill to the legislature which had now adjourned. Of course, the children had been working in the sugar mills for years, and had probably gone back and forth under the very eyes of the club women, but the women had never seen them, much less felt any obligation to protect them, until they joined a club, and the club joined a federation, and the federation appointed a child labor committee who sent them a schedule. With their quickened perceptions, they then saw the rescue of these familiar children in the light of a social obligation. Though some such experiences, the members of the Hull House Women's Club have obtained the power of seeing the concrete through the general, and have entered into various undertakings. Very early in its history, the club formed what was called a Social Extension Committee. Once a month, this committee gives parties to people in the neighborhood who, for any reason, seem forlorn and without much social pleasure. One evening they invited only Italian women, thereby crossing a distinct social gulf, for there certainly exists as great a sense of social difference between the prosperous Irish American women and the South Italian peasants as between any two sets of people in the city of Chicago. The Italian women, who were almost Eastern in their habits, all stayed at home and sent their husbands, and the Social Extension Committee entered the drawing room to find it occupied by rows of Italian working men who seemed to prefer to sit in chairs along the wall. They were quite ready to be socially extended, but plainly puzzled as to what it was all about. The evening finally developed into a very successful party, not so much because the committee were equal to it, as because the Italian men rose to the occasion. Untiring pairs of them danced the tarantella. They sang Neapolitan songs. One of them performed some of those wonderful sleight of hand tricks so often seen on the street of Naples. They explained the coral finger of St. Januarius which they wore. They politely ate the strange American refreshments, and when the evening was over, one of the committee said to me, "Do you know, I am ashamed of the way I have always talked about Dagos. They are quite like other people, only one must take a little more pains with them. I have been nagging my husband to move off M Street because they are moving in, but I am going to try staying a while and see if I can make a real acquaintance with some of them." To my mind at that moment the speaker had passed from the region of the uncultivated person into the possibilities of the cultivated person. The former is bounded by a narrow outlook on life, unable to overcome differences of dress and habit, and his interests are slowly contracting within a circumscribed area, while the latter constantly tends to be a more citizen of the world because of his growing understanding of all kinds of people with their varying experiences. We send our young people to Europe that they may lose their provincialism and be able to judge their fellows by a more universal test, as we send them to college that they may attain the cultural background and a larger outlook. All of these it is possible to acquire in other ways, as this member of the Women's Club has discovered for herself. The Social Extension Committee, under the leadership of an ex-president of the club, a Hull House resident with a wide acquaintance, also discover many of those lonely people of which every city contains so large a number. We are only slowly apprehending the very real danger to the individual who fails to establish some sort of general relation with the people who surround him. We are all more or less familiar with the results of isolation in rural districts. The Bronte sisters have portrayed the hideous immorality and savagery of the remote dwellers on the bleak moorlands of northern England. Miss Wilkins has written of the overdeveloped will of the solitary New Englander, but tales still wait to be told of the isolated city dweller. In addition to the lonely young men recently come to our town and the country family who have not yet made their connections, are many other people who, because of temperament or from an estimate of themselves which will not permit them to make friends with people around here, or who, because they are victim to a combination of circumstances, lead a life as lonely and untouched by the city about them as if they were in remote country districts. The very fact that it requires an effort to preserve isolation from the tenement home life which flows all around them, makes the character stiffer and harsher than mere country solitude could do. Many instances of this come to mind. The faded, ladylike hairdresser who came and went to her work for 20 years, carefully concealing her dwelling place from the other people in the shop, moving whenever they seemed too curious about it, and priding herself that no neighbor had ever stepped inside her door. And yet, when discovered through an asthma which forced her to crave friendly offices, she was most responsive and even gay in a social atmosphere. Another woman made a long effort to conceal the poverty resulting from her husband's inveterate gambling, and to secure for her children the educational advantages to which her family had always been accustomed. Her 5 children, who are now university graduates, do not realize how hard and solitary was her early married life when we first knew her, and she was beginning to regret the isolation in which her children were being reared, for she saw that their lack of early companionship would always cripple their power to make friends. She was glad to avail herself of the social resources of Hull House for them, and at last even for herself. The leader of the Social Extension Committee has also been able, through her connections with the vacant lot garden movement in Chicago, to maintain a most flourishing friendly club, largely composed of people who cultivate these garden plots. During the club evening, at least, they regain something of the ease of the man who is being estimated by bushels per acre of potatoes he has raised, and not by the flimsy city judgment often based upon store clothes. Their jollity and enthusiasm are unbounded, expressing itself in clog dances and rousing old songs, in sharp contrast to the overworked, worn aspect of the members. Of course, there are surprising possibilities discovered through other clubs in one of Greek women or in the Circolo Italiano, for a social club often affords a sheltered space in which the gentler social usages may be exercised, as the more vigorous clubs afford a point of departure into larger social concerns. The experiences of the Hull House Women's Club constantly react upon the family life of the members. Their husbands come with them to the annual midwinter reception, to club concerts and entertainments. The little children come to the May party with its dancing and games, and the older children to the day in June when prizes are given to those sons and daughters of the members who present a good school record as graduates either from the 8th grade or from a high school. It seemed, therefore, but a fit recognition of their efforts when the president of the club erected a building planned especially for their needs, with their own library and a hall large enough for their various social undertakings, although, of course, Bowen Hall is constantly put to many other uses. It was under the leadership of this same able president that the club achieved wider purposes and took its place with the other forces for city betterment. The club had begun, as nearly all women's clubs do, upon the basis of self improvement, although the foundations for this later development had been laid by one of their earlier presidents, who was the first probation officer of the juvenile court, and who had so shared her experiences with the club that each member felt the truth as well as the pathos of the lines inscribed in her memorial tablet erected in their club library: as more exposed to suffering and distress, thence also more alive to tenderness. Each woman had discovered opportunities in her own experience for this same tender understanding, and under its succeeding president, Mrs. Pelham, in its determination to be of use to the needy and distressed, the club developed many philanthropic undertakings, from the humble beginnings of a linen chest kept constantly filled with clothing for sick and poor. It required, however, an adequate knowledge of adverse city conditions so productive to juvenile delinquency, and a sympathy which could enkindle itself in many others of diverse faiths and training, to arouse the club to its finest public spirit. This was done by a later president, Mrs. Bowen, who, as head of the Juvenile Protective Association, had learned that the moralized energy of a group is best fitted to cope with the complicated problems of a city, but it required an ability of unusual order to evoke a sense of social obligation from the very knowledge of adverse city conditions which the club members possessed, and to connect it with the many civic and philanthropic organizations of the city in such wise as to make it socially useful. This financial and representative connection with outside organizations is valuable to the club only as it expresses its sympathy and kindliness at the same time in concrete form. A group of members who lunch with Mrs. Bowen each week at Hull House discuss not only topics of public interest, sometimes with experts whom they have long known through their mutual undertakings, but also their own club affairs in light of this larger knowledge. Thus the value of social clubs broadens out in one's mind to an instrument of companionship through which many may be led from a sense of isolation to one of civic responsibility, even as another type of club provides recreational facilities for those who have had only meaningless excitements, or, as a third type, opens new and interesting vistas of life to those who are ambitious. The entire organization of the social life at Hull House while it has been fostered and directed by residents and others, has been largely pushed and vitalized from within by the club members themselves. Sir Walter Besant once told me that Hull House stood, in his mind, more nearly for the ideal of the Palace of Delight than did the London People's Palace, because we had depended upon the social resources of the people using it. He begged me not to allow Hull House to become too educational. He believed it much easier to develop a polytechnic institute than a large recreational center, but he doubted whether the former was as useful. The social clubs form a basis of acquaintanceship for many people living in other parts of the city. Through friendly relations with individuals, which is perhaps the sanest method of approach, they are thus brought into contact, many of them for the first time, with the industrial and social problems challenging the moral resources of our contemporary life. During our 20 years, hundreds of these non-residents have directed clubs and classes and have increased the number of Chicago citizens who are conversant with adverse social conditions, and conscious that only by the unceasing devotion of each, according to his strength, shall the compulsions and hardships, the stupidities and cruelties of life be overcome. The number of people thus informed is constantly increasing in all our American cities, and they may in time remove the reproach of social neglect and indifference which has so long rested upon the citizens of the New World. I recall the experience of an Englishman who, not only because he was a member of the Queen's Cabinet and bore a title, but also because he was an able statesman, was entertained with great enthusiasm by the leading citizens of Chicago. At a large dinner party he asked the lady sitting next to him what our tenement house legislation was in regard to the cubic feet of air required for each occupant of a tenement bedroom. Upon disclaiming any knowledge of the subject, the inquiry was put to all the diners at the long table, all of whom showed surprise that they should be expected to possess this information. In telling me the incident afterward, the English guest said that such indifference could not have been found among the leading citizens of London, whose public spirit had been aroused to provide such housing conditions as should protect tenement dwellers at least from wanton loss of vitality and lowered industrial efficiency. When I met the same Englishman in London 5 years afterward, he immediately asked me whether Chicago citizens were still so indifferent to the conditions of the poor that they took no interest in their proper housing. I was quick with that defense which an American is obliged to use so often in Europe, that our very democracy so long presupposed that each citizen could care for himself, that we are slow to develop a sense of social obligation. He smiled at the familiar phrases and was still inclined to attribute our indifference to sheer ignorance of social conditions. The entire social development of Hull House is so unlike what I predicted 20 years ago that I venture to quote from that ancient writing as an end to this chapter. The social organism has broken down through large districts of our great city. Many of the people living there are very poor, the majority of them without leisure or energy for anything but the gain of subsistence. They live for the moment side by side, many of them without knowledge of each other, without fellowship, without local tradition or public spirit, without social organization of any kind. Practically nothing is done to remedy this. The people who might do it, who have the social tact and training, the large houses, and the traditions and customs of hospitality, live in other parts of the city. The clubhouses, libraries, galleries, and semi-public conveniences for social life are also blocks away. We find working men organized into armies of producers, because men of executive ability and business sagacity have found it to their interest thus to organize them. But these working men are not organized socially, although lodging in crowded tenement houses, they are living without a corresponding social contract. The chaos is as great as it would be were they working in huge factories without foreman or superintendent. Their ideas and resources are cramped, and the desire for higher social pleasure becomes extinct. They have no share in the traditions and social energy which make for progress. Too often their only place of meeting is a saloon, their only host a bartender. A local demagogue forms their public opinion. Men of ability and refinement, of social power and university cultivation, stay away from them. Personally, I believe the men who lose the most are those who stay away. But the paradox is here. When cultivated people do stay away from a certain portion of the population, when all social advantages are persistently withheld, it may be for years, the result itself is pointed to as a reason and is used as an argument for the continued withholding. It is constantly said that because the masses have never had social advantages, they do not want them, that they are heavy and dull, and that it will take political or philanthropic machinery to change them. This divides a city into rich and poor, into the favored, who express their sense of social obligation by gifts of money, and to the unfavored, who express it by clamoring for a share, both of them actuated by a vague sense of justice. This division of the city would be more justifiable, however, if the people who thus isolate themselves on certain streets and use their social ability for each other, gained enough thereby and added sufficient to the sum total of social progress to justify the withholding of the pleasure and results of that progress from so many people who ought to have them. But they cannot accomplish this, for the social spirit discharges itself in many forms, and no one form is adequate to its total expression. End of chapter 15. Recording by Linda Velwest.
Chapter 16 of 20 Years at Hull House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 20 Years at Hull House by Jane Addams. Chapter 16. Arts at Hull House. The first building erected for Hull House contained an art gallery well lighted for day and evening use, and our first exhibit of loaned pictures was opened in June 1891 by Mr. and Mrs. Barnett of London. It is always pleasant to associate their hearty sympathy with that first exhibit, and thus to connect it with their pioneer efforts at Toynbee Hall to secure for working people the opportunity to know the best art, and with their establishment of the first permanent art gallery in an industrial quarter. We took pride in the fact that our first exhibit contained some of the best pictures Chicago afforded, and we conscientiously insured them against fire and carefully guarded them by night and day. We had 5 of these exhibits during 2 years after the gallery was completed, 2 of oil paintings, 1 of old engravings and etchings, 1 of watercolors, and 1 of pictures especially selected for use in the public schools. These exhibits were surprisingly well attended, and thousands of votes were cast for the most popular pictures. Their value to the neighborhood, of course, had to be determined by each one of us according to the value he attached to beauty and the escape it offers from dreary reality into the realm of the imagination. Miss Starr always insisted that the arts should receive adequate recognition at Hull House, and urged that one must always remember the hungry individual soul which without art will have passed unsolaced and unfed, followed by other souls who lack the impulse his should have given. The exhibits afforded pathetic evidence that the older immigrants do not expect the solace of art in this country. An Italian expressed great surprise when he found that we, although Americans, still liked pictures, and said quite naively that he didn't know that Americans cared for anything but dollars, that looking at pictures was something people only did in Italy. The extreme isolation of the Italian colony was demonstrated by the fact that he did not know that there was a public art gallery in the city, nor any houses in which pictures were regarded as treasures. A Greek was much surprised to see a photograph of the Acropolis at Hull House because he had lived in Chicago for 13 years and had never before met any Americans who knew about this foremost glory of the world. Before he left Greece, he had imagined that Americans would be most eager to see pictures of Athens, and as he was a graduate of a school of technology, He had prepared a book of colored drawings and had made a collection of photographs which he was sure Americans would enjoy. But although from his fruit stand near one of the large railroad stations he had conversed with many Americans and had often tried to lead the conversation back to ancient Greece, no one had responded, and he had at last concluded that the people of Chicago knew nothing of ancient times. The loan exhibits were continued until the Chicago Art Institute was opened free to the public on Sunday afternoons, and parties were arranged at Hull House and conducted there by a guide. In time, even these parties were discontinued as the galleries became better known in all parts of the city, and the Art Institute management did much to make pictures popular. From the first, a studio was maintained at Hull House which has developed through the changing years under the direction of Miss Benedict, one of the residents who is a member of the faculty in the Art Institute. Buildings on the Hull House quadrangle furnish studios for artists who find something of the same spirit in the contiguous Italian colony that the French artist is traditionally supposed to discover in his beloved Latin Quarter. These artists uncover something of the picturesque in the foreign colonies, which they have reproduced in painting, etching, and lithography. They find their classes filled not only by young people possessing facility and sometimes talent, but also by older people to whom the studio affords the one opportunity of escape from dreariness. A widow with 4 children who supplemented a very inadequate income by teaching the piano, for 6 years never missed her weekly painting lesson because it was her one pleasure. Another woman, whose youth and strength had gone into the care of an invalid father, poured into her afternoon in the studio once a week all the longing for self-expression which she habitually suppressed. Perhaps the most satisfactory results of the studio have been obtained through the classes of young men who are engaged in the commercial arts, and who are glad to have an opportunity to work out their own ideas. This is true of young engravers and lithographers, of the men who have to do with posters and illustrations in various ways. The little pile of stones and the lithographer's hand press in a corner of the studio have been used in many an experiment, as has a set of beautiful type loaned to Hull House by a bibliophile. The work of the studio almost imperceptibly merged into the crafts, and well within the first decade a shop was opened at Hull House under the direction of several residents who were also members of the Chicago Arts and Crafts Society. This shop is not merely a school where people are taught and then sent forth to use their teaching in art according to their individual initiative and opportunity, but where those who have already been carefully trained may express the best they can in wood or metal. The settlement soon discovers how difficult it is to put a fringe of art on the end of a day spent in a factory. We constantly see young people doing over-hurried work. Wrapping bars of soap in pieces of paper might at least give the pleasure of accuracy and repetition if it could be done at a normal pace, but when paid for by the piece, speed becomes the sole requirement and the last suggestion of human interest is taken away. In contrast to this, the Hull House shop affords many examples of the restorative power in the exercise of a genuine craft. A young Russian who, like too many of his countrymen, had made a desperate effort to fit himself for a learned profession, and who had almost finished his course in a night law school, used to watch constantly the work being done in the metal shop at Hull House. One evening, in a moment of sudden resolve, he took off his coat, sat down at one of the benches, and began to work, obviously as a very clever silversmith. He had long concealed his craft because he thought it would hurt his efforts as a lawyer, and because he imagined an office more honorable and more American than a shop. As he worked on during his 2 leisure evenings each week, his entire bearing and conversation registered the relief of one who abandons the effort he is not fitted for and becomes a man on his own feet, expressing himself through a familiar and delicate technique. Miss Starr at length found herself quite impatient with her role of lecturer on the arts, while all the handicraft about her was untouched by beauty and did not even reflect the interest of the workman. She took a training in bookbinding in London under Mr. Cobden Sanderson, and established her bindery at Hull House, in which design and workmanship beauty and thoroughness are taught to a small number of apprentices. From the very first winter, concerts which are still continued were given every Sunday afternoon in the Hull House drawing room, and later, as the audiences increased, in the larger halls. For these we are indebted to musicians from every part of the city. Mr. William Tomlins early trained large choruses of adults, as his assistants did of children, and the response to all of these showed that while the number of people in our vicinity caring for the best music was not large, they constituted a steady and appreciative group. It was in connection with these first choruses that a public-spirited citizen of Chicago offered a prize for the best labor song, competition to be open to the entire country. The responses to the offer literally filled 3 large barrels, and speaking at least for myself as one of the bewildered judges, we were more disheartened by their quality than even by their overwhelming bulk. Apparently the workers of America are not yet ready to sing, although I recall a creditable chorus trained at Hull House for a large meeting in sympathy with the anthracite coal strike, in which the swinging lines, "Who was it made the coal, our God as well as theirs?" seemed to relieve the tension of the moment. Miss Eleanor Smith, the head of the Hull House Music School, who had put the words to music, performed the same office for the sweatshop of the Yiddish poet, the translation of which presents so graphically the bewilderment and tedium of the New York shop that it might be applied to almost any other machinery industry, as the first verse indicates. The roaring of the wheels has filled my ears, the clashing and the clamor shut me in, myself, my soul in chaos disappears, I cannot think or feel amid the din. It may be that this plaint explains the lack of labor songs in this period of industrial maladjustment, when the worker is overmastered by his very tools. In addition to sharing with our neighborhood the best music we could procure, we have conscientiously provided careful musical instruction that at least a few young people might understand those old usages of art, that they might master its trade secrets, for after all it is only through a careful technique that artistic ability can express itself and be preserved. From the beginning we had classes in music, and the Hull House Music School, which is housed in quarters of its own in our quieter court, was opened in 1893. The school is designed to give a thorough musical instruction to a limited number of children. From the first lessons they are taught to compose, and to reduce to order the musical suggestions which may come to them, and in this wise the school has sometimes been able to recover the songs of the immigrants through their children. Some of these folk songs have never been committed to paper, but have survived through the centuries because of a touch of undying poetry which the world has always cherished, as in the song of a Russian who is digging a post-hole and finds his task dull and difficult until he strikes a stratum of red sand, which in addition to making digging easy, reminds him of the red hair of his sweetheart, and all goes merrily as the song lifts into a joyous melody. I recall again the almost hilarious enjoyment of the adult audience to whom it was sung by the children who had revived it, as well as the more sober appreciation of the hymns taken from the lips of the cantor, whose father before him had officiated in the synagogue. The recitals and concerts given by the school are attended by large and appreciative audiences. On the Sunday before Christmas, the program of Christmas songs draws together people of the most diverging faiths. In the deep tones of the memorial organ erected at Hull House, we realize that music is perhaps the most potent agent for making the universal appeal and inducing men to forget their differences. Some of the pupils in the music school have developed during the years into trained musicians and are supporting themselves in their chosen profession. On the other hand, we constantly see the most promising musical ability extinguished when the young people enter industries which so sap their vitality that they cannot carry on serious study in the scanty hours outside of factory work. Many cases indisputably illustrate this. A Bohemian girl who, in order to earn money for pressing family needs, first ruined her voice in a 6 months constant vaudeville engagement, returned to her trade working overtime in a vain effort to continue the vaudeville income. Another young girl whom Hull House had sent to the high school so long as her parents consented, because we realized that a beautiful voice is often unavailable through lack of the informing mind, later extinguished her promise in a tobacco factory. A third girl, who had supported her little sisters since she was 14, eagerly used her fine voice for earning money at entertainments held late after her day's work, until exposure and fatigue ruined her health as well as a musician's future. A young man whose music-loving family gave him every possible opportunity, and who produced some charming and even joyous songs during the long struggle with tuberculosis which preceded his death, had made a brave beginning, not only as a teacher of music, but as a composer. In the little service held at Hull House in his memory, when the children sang his composition, "How Sweet is the Shepherd's Sweet Lot," it was hard to realize that such an interpretive pastoral could have been produced by one whose childhood had been passed in a crowded city quarter. Even that bitter experience did not prepare us for the sorrowful year when 6 promising pupils out of a class of 15 developed tuberculosis. It required but little penetration to see that during the 8 years the class of 15 school children had come together to the music school, they had approximately an even chance. But as soon as they reached the legal working age, only a scanty moiety of those who had become self-supporting could endure the strain of long hours and bad air. Thus the average human youth, with all the sweetness of the common dawn, is flung into the vortex of industrial life, wherein the everyday tragedy escapes us, save when one of them becomes conspicuously unfortunate. Twice in 1 year we were compelled to find the inheritance of this poor child, his little kingdom of a forced grave. It has been pointed out many times that art lives by devouring her own offspring, and the world has come to justify even that sacrifice. But we are unfortified and unsolaced when we see the children of art devoured, not by her, but by the uncouth stranger, modern industry, who, needlessly ruthless and brutal to her own children, is quickly fatal to the offspring of the gentler mother. And so schools in art for those who go to work at the age when more fortunate young people are still sheltered and educated constantly epitomize one of the haunting problems of life. Why do we permit the waste of this most precious human faculty, this consummate possession of civilization? When we fail to provide the vessel in which it may be treasured, it runs out upon the ground and is irretrievably lost. The universal desire for the portrayal of life lying quite outside of personal experience evinces itself in many forms. One of the conspicuous features of our neighborhood, as of all industrial quarters, is the persistency with which the entire population attends the theater. The very first day I saw Halsted Street, a long line of young men and boys stood outside the gallery entrance of the Bijou Theater, waiting for the Sunday matinee to begin at 2 o'clock, although it was only high noon. This waiting crowd might have been seen every Sunday afternoon during the 20 years which have elapsed since then. Our first Sunday evening in Hull House, when a group of small boys sat on our piazza and told us about things around here, their talk was all of the theater and of the astonishing things they had seen that afternoon. But quite as it was difficult to discover the habits and purposes of this group of boys, because they much preferred talking about the theater to contemplating their own lives, so it was all along the line. The young men told us their ambitions in the phrases of stage heroes, and the girls, so far as their romantic dreams could be shyly put into words, possessed no others but those soiled by long use in the melodrama. All of these young people looked upon an afternoon a week in the gallery of a Halsted Street theater as their one opportunity to see life. The sort of melodrama they see there has recently been described as the 10 Commandments written in red fire. Certainly the villain always comes to a violent end, and the young and handsome hero is rewarded by marriage with a beautiful girl, usually the daughter of a millionaire. But after all, that is not a portrayal of the morality of the 10 Commandments any more than of life itself. Nevertheless, the theater, such as it was, appeared to be the one agency which freed the boys and girls from that destructive isolation of those who drag themselves up to maturity by themselves, and it gave them a glimpse of that order and beauty into which even the poorest drama endeavors to restore the bewildering facts of life. The most prosaic young people bear testimony to this overmastering desire. A striking illustration of this came to us during our second year's residence on Halsted Street through an incident in the Italian colony, where the men have always boasted that they were able to guard their daughters from the dangers of city life, and until evil Italians entered the business of the white slave traffic, their boast was well founded. The first Italian girl to go astray known to the residents of Hull House was so fascinated by the stage that on her way home from work she always loitered outside a theater before the enticing posters. 3 months after her elopement with an actor, her distracted mother received a picture of her dressed in the men's clothes in which she appeared in vaudeville. Her family mourned her as dead, and her name was never mentioned among them, nor in the entire colony. In further illustration of an overmastering desire to see life as portrayed on the stage, are 2 young girls whose sober parents did not approve of the theater, and who would allow no money for such foolish purposes. In sheer desperation, the sisters evolved a plot that one of them would feign a toothache, and while she was having her tooth pulled by a neighboring dentist, the other would steal the gold crowns from his table, and with the money thus procured they could attend the vaudeville theater every night on their way home from work. Apparently the pain and wrongdoing did not weigh for a moment against the anticipated pleasure. The plan was carried out to the point of selling the gold crowns to a pawnbroker, when the disappointed girls were arrested. All this effort to see the play took place in the years before the 5-cent theaters had become a feature of every crowded city thoroughfare, and before their popularity had induced the attendance of 2.25 million people in the United States every 24 hours. The eagerness of the penniless children to get into these magic spaces is responsible for an entire crop of petty crimes, made more easy because 2 children are admitted for 1 nickel at the last performance when the hour is late and the theater nearly deserted. The Hull House residents were aghast at the early popularity of these mimic shows, and in the days before the inspection of films and the present regulations for the 5-cent theaters, we established at Hull House a moving picture show. Although its success justified its existence, it was so obviously but one in the midst of hundreds that it seemed much more advisable to turn our attention to the improvement of all of them, or rather to assist as best we could the successful efforts in this direction by the Juvenile Protective Association. However, long before the 5-cent theater was even heard of, we had accumulated much testimony as to the power of the drama, and we would have been dull indeed if we had not availed ourselves of the use of the play at Hull House, not only as an agent of recreation and education, but as a vehicle of self-expression for the teeming young life all about us. Long before the Hull House Theatre was built, we had many plays, first in the drawing room and later in the gymnasium. The young people's clubs never tired of rehearsing and preparing for these dramatic occasions, and we also discovered that older people were almost equally ready and talented. We quickly learned that no celebration at Thanksgiving was so popular as a graphic portrayal on the stage of the Pilgrim Fathers, and we were often put to it to reduce to dramatic effects the great days of patriotism and religion. At one of our early Christmas celebrations, Longfellow's Golden Legend was given, the actors portraying it with the touch of the miracle play spirit which it reflects. I remember an old blind man who took the part of a shepherd said, at the end of the last performance, "Kind heart," a name by which he always addressed me. It seems to me that I have been waiting all my life to hear some of these things said. I am glad we had so many performances, for I think I can remember them to the end. It is getting hard for me to listen to reading, but the different voices and all made this very plain. Had he not perhaps made a legitimate demand upon the drama, that it shall express for us that which we have not been able to formulate for ourselves, that it shall warm us with a sense of companionship with the experiences of others? Does not every genuine drama present our relations to each other and to the world in which we find ourselves in such wise as may fortify us to the end of the journey? The immigrants in the neighborhood of Hull House have utilized our little stage in an endeavor to reproduce the past of their own nations through those immortal dramas which have escaped from the restraining bond of one country into the land of the universal. A large colony of Greeks near Hull House, who often feel that their history and classic background are completely ignored by Americans, and that they are easily confused with the more ignorant immigrants from the other parts of southeastern Europe, welcome an occasion to present Greek plays in the ancient text. With expert help in the difficulties of staging and rehearsing a classic play, they reproduced the Ajax of Sophocles upon the Hull House stage. It was a genuine triumph to the actors who felt that they were showing forth the glory of Greece to ignorant Americans. The scholar who came with a copy of Sophocles in hand and followed the play with real enjoyment did not in the least realize that the revelation of the love of Greek poets was mutual between the audience and the actors. The Greeks have quite recently assisted an enthusiast in producing Electra, while the Lithuanians, the Poles, and other Russian subjects often use the Hull House stage to present plays in their own tongue, which shall at one and the same time keep alive their sense of participation in the great Russian Revolution and relieve their feelings in regard to it. There is something still more appealing in the yearning efforts the immigrants sometimes make to formulate their situation in America. I recall a play written by an Italian playwright of our neighborhood, which depicted the insolent break between Americanized sons and old country parents so touchingly that it moved to tears all the older Italians in the audience. Did the tears of each express relief in finding that others had had the same experience as himself? And did the knowledge free each one from a sense of isolation and an injured belief that his children were the worst of all? This effort to understand life through its dramatic portrayal, to see one's own participation intelligibly set forth, becomes difficult when one enters the field of social development. But even here it is not impossible if a settlement group is constantly searching for new material. A labor story appearing in the Atlantic Monthly was kindly dramatized for us by the author, who also superintended its presentation upon the Hull House stage. The little drama presented the untutored effort of a trades union man to secure for his side the beauty of self-sacrifice, the glamour of martyrdom, which so often seems to belong solely to the non-union forces. The presentation of the play was attended by an audience of trades unionists and employers, and those other people who are supposed to make public opinion. Together they felt the moral beauty of the man's conclusion that it's the side that suffers most that will win out in this war. The saints is the only ones that has got the world under their feet. We've got to do the way they done if the unions is to stand. So completely that it seemed quite natural that he should forfeit his life upon the truth of this statement. The dramatic arts have gradually been developed at Hull House through amateur companies, one of which has held together for more than 15 years. The members were originally selected from the young people who had evinced talent in the plays the social clubs were always giving, but the association now adds to itself only as vacancy occurs. Some of them have developed almost a professional ability, although contrary to all predictions and in spite of several offers, none of them have taken to a stage career. They present all sorts of plays from melodrama and comedy to those of Shaw, Ibsen, and Galsworthy. The latter are surprisingly popular, perhaps because of their sincere attempt to expose the shams and pretenses of contemporary life, and to penetrate into some of its perplexing social and domestic situations. Through such plays, the stage may become a pioneer teacher of social righteousness. I have come to believe, however, that the stage may do more than teach, that much of our current moral instruction will not endure the test of being cast into a lifelike mold, and when presented in dramatic form will reveal itself as platitudinous and effete. That which may have sounded like righteous teaching when it was remote and wordy will be challenged afresh when it is obliged to simulate life itself. This function of the stage, as a reconstructing and reorganizing agent of accepted moral truths, came to me with overwhelming force as I listened to the Passion Play at Oberammergau one beautiful summer's day in 1900. The peasants who portray exactly the successive scenes of the wonderful life, who used only the very words found in the accepted version of the Gospels, yet curiously modernized and reoriented the message. They made clear that the opposition to the young teacher sprang from the merchants whose traffic in the temple he had disturbed, and from the Pharisees who were dependent upon them for support. Their query was curiously familiar, as they demanded the antecedents of the radical who dared to touch vested interests, who presumed to dictate the morality of trade, and who insulted the marts of honest merchants by calling them a den of thieves. As the play developed, it became clear that this powerful opposition had friends in church and state, that they controlled influences which ramified in all directions. They obviously believed in their statement of the case, and their very wealth and position in the community gave their words such weight that finally all of their hearers were convinced that the young agitator must be done away with in order that the highest interests of society might be conserved. These simple peasants made it clear that it was the money power which induced one of the agitator's closest friends to betray him, and the villain of the piece, Judas himself, was only a man who was so dazzled by money, so under the domination of all it represented, that he was perpetually blind to the spiritual vision unrolling before him. As I sat through the long summer day, seeing the shadows on the beautiful mountain back of the open stage shift from one side to the other, and finally grow long and pointed in the soft evening light, my mind was filled with perplexing questions. Did the dramatization of the life of Jesus set forth its meaning more clearly and conclusively than talking and preaching could possibly do, as a shadowy following of the command to do the will? The peasant actors whom I had seen returning from Mass that morning had prayed only to portray the life as he had lived it, and, behold, out of their simplicity and piety arose this modern version which even Harnack was only then venturing to suggest to his advanced colleagues in Berlin. Yet the Oberammergau fold were very like thousands of immigrant men and women of Chicago, both in their experiences and their familiarity with the hard facts of life. And throughout that day, as my mind dwelt on my faraway neighbors, I was reproached with the sense of an ungarnered harvest. Of course, such a generally uplifted state comes only at rare moments. While the development of the little theater at Hull House has not depended on the moods of any one, but upon the genuine enthusiasm and sustained effort of a group of residents, several of them artists who have ungrudgingly given their time to it year after year, this group has long fostered junior dramatic associations, through which it seems possible to give a training in manners and morals more directly than through any other medium. They have learned to determine very cleverly the ages at which various types of the drama are most congruous and expressive of the sentiments of the little troops. From the fairy plays such as Snow White and Puss in Boots, which appeal to the youngest children, to the heroic plays of William Tell, King John, and Wat Tyler for the older lads, and to the romances and comedies which set forth in stately fashion the elaborated life which so many young people admire. A group of Jewish boys gave a dramatic version of the story of Joseph and his brethren, and again of Queen Esther. They had almost a sense of proprietorship in the fine old lines, and were pleased to bring from home bits of Talmudic lore for the stage setting. The same club of boys at one time will buoyantly give a roaring comedy, and 5 years later will solemnly demand a drama dealing with modern industrial conditions. The Hull House Theatre is also rented from time to time to members of the Young People's Socialist League, who give plays both in Yiddish and English which reduce their propaganda to conversation. Through such humble experiments as the Hull House stage, as well as through the more ambitious reforms which are attempted in various parts of the country, the theatre may at last be restored to its rightful place in the community. There have been times when our little stage was able to serve the Théâtre Libre. A Chicago troupe, finding it difficult to break into a trust theatre, used it one winter twice a week for the presentation of Ibsen and old French comedy. A visit from the Irish poet Yeats inspired us to do our share towards freeing the stage from its slavery to expensive scene-setting, and a forest of stiff conventional trees against a gilt sky still remains with us as a reminder of an attempt not wholly unsuccessful in this direction. This group of Hull House artists have filled our little foyer with a series of charming playbills, and by dint of painting their own scenery and making their own costumes, have obtained beguiling results in stage setting. Sometimes all the artistic resources of the house unite in a Wagnerian combination. Thus the text of The Troll's Holiday was written by one resident, set to music by another, sung by the music school, and placed upon the stage under the careful direction and training of the dramatic committee. And the little brown trolls could never have tumbled about so gracefully in their gleaming caves unless they had been taught in the gymnasium. Some such synthesis takes place every year at the Hull House annual exhibition, when an effort is made to bring together in a spirit of holiday the 9,000 people who come to the house every week during duller times. Curiously enough, the central feature at the annual exhibition seems to be the brass band of the Boys' Club, which apparently dominates the situation by sheer size and noise, but perhaps their fresh boyish enthusiasm expresses that which the older people take more soberly. As the stage of our little theatre had attempted to portray the heroes of many lands, so we planned one early spring 7 years ago to carry out a scheme of mural decoration upon the walls of the theatre itself, which should portray those cosmopolitan heroes who have become great through their identification with the common lot in preference to the heroes of mere achievement. In addition to the group of artists living at Hull House, several others were in temporary residence, and they all threw themselves enthusiastically into the plan. The series began with Tolstoy ploughing his field, which was painted by an artist of the Glasgow school, and the next was of the young Lincoln pushing his flatboat down the Mississippi River at the moment he received his first impression of the great iniquity. This was done by a promising young artist of Chicago, and the wall spaces nearest to the two selected heroes were quickly filled with their immortal sayings. A spirited discussion thereupon ensued in regard to the heroes for the two remaining large wall spaces, when, to the surprise of all of us, the group of 25 residents who had lived in unbroken harmony for more than 10 years suddenly broke up into cults and even camps of hero worship. Each cult exhibited drawings of its own hero in his most heroic moment, and of course each drawing received enthusiastic backing from the neighborhood, each according to the nationality of the hero. Thus Phidias standing high on his scaffold as he finished the heroic head of Athene, the young David dreamily playing his harp as he tended his father's sheep at Bethlehem, St. Francis washing the feet of the leper, the young slave Patrick guiding his master through the bogs of Ireland, which he later rid of their dangers, the poet Hans Sachs cobbling shoes, Jeanne d'Arc dropping her spindle in startled wonder before the heavenly visitants. Naturally, all obtained such enthusiastic following from our cosmopolitan neighborhood that it was certain to give offense if any two were selected. Then there was the cult of residents who wished to keep the series contemporaneous with the two heroes already painted, and they advocated William Morris at his loom, Walt Whitman tramping the open road, Pasteur in his laboratory, or Florence Nightingale seeking the wounded on the field of battle. But beyond the socialists, few of the neighbors had heard of William Morris, and the fame of Walt Whitman was still more apocryphal. Pasteur was considered merely a clever scientist without the romance which evokes popular affection, and in the provisional drawing submitted for votes, gentle Florence Nightingale was said to look more as if she were robbing the dead than succoring the wounded. The remark shows how high the feeling ran, and then, as something must be done quickly, we tried to unite upon strictly local heroes such as the famous fire marshal who had lived for many years in our neighborhood. But why prolong this description, which demonstrates once more that art, if not always the handmaid of religion, yet insists upon serving those deeper sentiments for which we unexpectedly find ourselves ready to fight. When we were all fatigued and hopeless of compromise, we took refuge in a series of landscapes connected with our two heroes by a quotation from Wordsworth, slightly distorted to meet our dire need, but still stating his impassioned belief in the efficacious spirit capable of companionship with man, which resides in particular spots. Certainly peace emanates from the particular folding of the hills in one of our treasured mural landscapes, Yet occasionally when a guest with a bewildered air looks from one side of the theater to the other, we are forced to conclude that the connection is not convincing. In spite of its stormy career, this attempt at mural decoration connects itself quite naturally with the spirit of our earlier efforts to make Hull House as beautiful as we could, which had in it a desire to embody in the outward aspect of the house something of the reminiscence and aspiration of the neighborhood life. As the house enlarged for new needs and mellowed through slow-growing associations, we endeavored to fashion it from without, as it were, as well as from within. A tiny wall fountain, modeled in classic pattern, for us penetrates into the world of the past. But for the Italian immigrant it may defy distance and barriers, as he dimly responds to that typical beauty in which Italy has ever written its message, even as classic art knew no region of the gods which was not also sensuous, and as the art of Dante mysteriously blended the material and the spiritual. Perhaps the early devotion of the Hull House residents to the pre-Raphaelites recognized that they, above all English-speaking poets and painters, reveal the sense of the expressiveness of outward things, which is at once the glory and the limitation of the arts. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of 20 Years at Hull House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Double Mirrors. 20 Years at Hull House by Jane Addams. Chapter 17. Echoes of the Russian Revolution. The residents of Hull House have always seen many evidences of the Russian Revolution. A forlorn family of little children whose parents have been massacred at Kishinev are received and supported by their relatives in our Chicago neighborhood. Or a Russian woman, her face streaming with tears of indignation and pity, asks you to look at the scarred back of her sister, a young girl, who has escaped with her life from the whips of the Cossack soldiers. Or a studious young woman suddenly disappears from the Hull House classes because she has returned to Kiev to be near her brother while he is in prison, that she may earn money for the nourishing food which alone will keep him from contracting tuberculosis. Or we attend a protest meeting against the newest outrages of the Russian government, in which the speeches are interrupted by the groans whose sons have been sacrificed, and by the hisses of others who cannot repress their indignation. At such moments an American is acutely conscious of our ignorance of the greatest tragedy of modern times, and at our indifference to the waste of perhaps the noblest human material among our contemporaries. Certain it is, as the distinguished Russian revolutionists have come to Chicago, they have impressed me, as no one else has ever done, as belonging to that noble company of martyrs who have ever again poured forth blood that human progress might be advanced. Sometimes these men and women have addressed audiences gathered quite outside the Russian colony, and have filled to overflowing Chicago's largest halls with American citizens deeply touched by this message of martyrdom. One significant meeting was addressed by a member of the Russian Duma and by one of Russia's oldest and sanest revolutionists, another by Madame Breshkovsky, who later languished a prisoner in the fortress of St. Peter and St. Paul. In this wonderful procession of revolutionists, Prince Kropotkin, or as he prefers to be called, Peter Kropotkin, was doubtless the most distinguished. When he came to America to lecture, he was heard throughout the country with great interest and respect. That he was a guest of Hull House during his stay in Chicago attracted little attention at the time, but 2 years later, when the assassination of President McKinley occurred, the visit of this kindly scholar, who had always called himself an anarchist, and had certainly written fiery tracts in his younger manhood, was made the basis of an attack upon Hull House by a daily newspaper, which ignored the fact that Prince Kropotkin had addressed the Chicago Arts and Crafts Society at Hull House, giving a digest of his remarkable books on fields, factories and workshops. He had also spoken at state universities of Illinois and Wisconsin, and before the leading literary and scientific societies of Chicago. These institutions and societies were not, therefore, called anarchistic. Hull House had undoubtedly laid itself open to this attack through an incident connected with the imprisonment of the editor on an anarchistic paper, who was arrested in Chicago immediately after the assassination of President McKinley. In the excitement following the national calamity and the avowal by the assassin of the influence of the anarchistic lecture to which he had listened, arrests were made in Chicago of everyone suspected of anarchy, in the belief that a widespread plot would be uncovered. The editor's house was searched for incriminating literature, his wife and daughter taken to a police station, and his son and himself, with several other suspected anarchists, were placed in the disused cells in the basement of the City Hall. It is impossible to overstate the public excitement of the moment, and the unfathomable sense of horror with which the community regarded an attack upon the chief execution of the nation as a crime against government itself, which compels an instinctive recoil from all law-abiding citizens. Doubtless both the horror and recoil have their roots deep down in human experience. The earliest forms of government implied a group which offered competent resistance to outsiders, but assuming no protection was necessary between any two of its own members, promptly punished with death the traitor who had assaulted anyone within. An anarchistic attack against an official thus furnishes an accredited basis both for unreasoning hatred and for prompt punishment. Both the hatred and the determination to punish reached the highest pitch in Chicago after the assassination of President McKinley, and the group of wretched men detained in the old-fashioned, scarcely habitable cells had not the least idea of their ultimate fate. They were not allowed to see an attorney, and were kept incommunicado, as their excited friends called it. I had seen the editor and his family only during Prince Kropotkin's stay at Hull House, when they had come to visit him several times. The editor had impressed me as a quiet, scholarly man, challenging the social order by the philosophic touchstone of Bakunin and Herbert Spencer, somewhat startled by the radicalism of his fiery young son, and much comforted by the German domesticity of his wife and daughter. Perhaps it was but my hysterical symptom of the universal excitement, but it certainly seemed to me more than I could bear when a group of his individualistic friends, who had come to ask for help, said, "You see what becomes of your boasted law. The authorities won't even allow an attorney, nor will they accept bail for these men, against whom nothing can be proved, although the veriest criminals are not denied such a right." Challenged by an anarchist, one is always sensitive for the honour of legally constituted society, and I replied that of course the men could have an attorney, that the assassin himself would eventually be furnished with one, that the fact that a man was an anarchist had nothing to do with his rights before the law. I was met with the retort that might do for a theory, but that the fact still remained that these men had been absolutely isolated, seeing no one but policemen, who constantly frightened them with tales of public clamour and threatened lynching. The conversation took place on Saturday night, and as the final police authority rests in the mayor, with a friend who was equally disturbed over the situation, I repaired to his house on Sunday morning to appeal to him in the interest of a law and order that should not yield to panic. We contended that to the anarchist above all men, it must be demonstrated that law is impartial, and stands the test of every strain. The mayor heard us through with the ready sympathy of the successful politician. He insisted, however, that the men thus far had merely been properly protected against lynching, but that it might now be safe to allow them to see one. He would not yet, however, take the responsibility of permitting an attorney, but if I myself chose to see them on the humanitarian errand of an assurance of fair play, he would write me a permit at once. I promptly fell into the trap, if trap it was, and within half an hour was in a corridor in the City Hall basement, talking to the distracted editor and surrounded by a cordon of police, who assured me that it was not safe to permit him out of his cell. The editor, who had grown thin and haggard under his suspense, asked immediately as to the whereabouts of his wife and daughter, concerning whom he had heard not a word since he had seen them arrested. Gradually he became composed as he learned, not that his testimony had been believed to the effect that he had never seen the assassin but once, and had then considered him a foolish, half-witted creature, but that the most thoroughgoing dragnet investigations on the part of the united police of the country had failed to discover a plot, that the public was gradually becoming convinced that the dastardly act was that of a solitary man with no political or social affiliations. The entire conversation was simple, and did not seem to me unlike, in motive or character, interviews I had had with many another forlorn man who had fallen into prison. I had scarce returned to Hull House, however, before it was filled with reporters, and I at once discovered that whether or not I had helped a brother out of a pit, I had fallen into a deep one myself. A period of sharp public opprobrium followed, traces of which I suppose will always remain. And yet in the midst of the letters of protest and accusation which made my mail a horror every morning, came a few letters of another sort, one from a federal judge whom I had never seen, and another from a distinguished professor in the constitutional law, who congratulated me on what they termed a sane attempt to uphold the law in time of panic. Although one or two ardent young people rushed into print to defend me from the charge of abetting anarchy, it seemed to me at the time that mere words could not avail. I had felt that the protection of the law itself extended to the most unpopular citizen was the only reply to the anarchistic argument, to the effect that this moment of panic revealed the truth of their theory of government, that the custodians of law and order have become the government itself, quite as the armed men hired by the medieval guards to protect them in the peaceful pursuit of their avocations, through sheer possession of arms, finally made themselves rulers of the city. At that moment I was firmly convinced that the public could only be convicted of the blindness of its course, when a body of people with 100-fold of the moral energy possessed by a settlement group should make clear that there is no method by which any community can be guarded against sporadic efforts on the part of half-crazed, discouraged men, save by a sense of mutual rights and securities which will include the veriest outcast. It seemed to me then that in the millions of words uttered and written at the time, no one adequately urged that public-spirited citizens set themselves the task of patiently discovering how these sporadic acts of violence against government may be understood and averted. We do not know whether they occur among the discouraged and the unassimilated immigrants, who might be cared for in such a way as enormously to lessen the probability of these acts, or whether they are the result of anarchistic teaching. By hastily concluding the latter and the sole explanation for them, we make no attempt to heal and cure the situation. Failure to make a proper diagnosis may mean treatment of a disease which does not exist, or it may furthermore mean that the dire malady from which the patient is suffering be permitted to develop unchecked. And yet, as the details of the meagre life of the President's assassin were disclosed, they were a challenge to the forces for social betterment in American cities. Was it not an indictment to all those whose business it is to interpret and solace the wretched, that a boy should have grown up in an American city so uncared for, so untouched by higher issues, his wounds of life so unhealed by religion, that the first talk he ever heard dealing with life's wrongs, although anarchistic and violent, should yet appear to point a way of relief? The conviction that a sense of fellowship is the only implement which will break into the locked purpose of a half-crazed creature bent upon destruction in the name of justice came to me through an experience recited to me at this time by an old anarchist. He was a German cobbler who, through all the changes in the manufacturing of shoes, had steadily clung to his little shop on a Chicago thoroughfare, partly as an expression of his individualism, and partly because he preferred bitter poverty and a place of his own to good wages under a disciplinary foreman. The assassin of President McKinley, on his way through Chicago only a few days before he had committed his dastardly deed, had visited all of the anarchists who he could find in the city, asking them for the password, as he called it. They, of course, possessed no such thing, and had turned him away, some with disgust and all with a certain degree of impatience, as a type of the ill-balanced man who, as they put it, was always hanging around the movement without the slightest concept of its meaning. Among other people he visited the German cobbler, who treated him much as the others had done, but who, after the event had made clear the identity of his visitor, was filled with the most bitter remorse that he had failed to utilize his chance meeting with the assassin to deter him from his purpose. He knew as well as any psychologist who had read the history of such solitary men that the only possible way to break down such a persistent and secretive purpose was by the kindliness which might have induced confession, which might have restored the assassin into fellowship with normal men. In the midst of his bitter remorse, the cobbler told me a tale of his own youth, that years before, when an ardent young fellow in Germany, newly converted to the philosophy of anarchism, as he called it, he had made up his mind that the Church, as much as the State, was responsible for human oppression, and that this fact could best be set forth in the deed by the public destruction of a clergyman or priest, that he had carried firearms for a year with this purpose in mind, but that one pleasant summer evening, in a moment of weakness, he had confided his intentions to a friend, and that from that moment he not only lost all desire to carry it out, but it seemed to him the most preposterous thing imaginable. In concluding the story he said, "That poor fellow just sat beside me on the bench. If I had only put my hand on his shoulder and said, 'Now look here, brother, what is on your mind? What makes you talk of such nonsense? Tell me. I have seen much of life and understand all kinds of men. I have been young and hot-headed and foolish myself.' If he had told me of his purpose then and there, he would never have carried it out. The whole nation would have been spared this horror." As he continued, he shook his grey head and sighed as if the whole incident were more than he could bear, one of those terrible sins of omission, one of those things he ought to have done, the memory of which is so hard to endure. The attempt a settlement makes to interpret American institutions to those who are bewildered concerning them, either because of their personal experiences or because of preconceived theories, would seem to lie in the direct path of its public obligations, and yet it is apparently impossible for the overwrought community to distinguish between the excitement the settlements are endeavouring to understand and to ally the attitude of the settlement itself. At times of public panic, fervid denunciation is held to be the duty of every good citizen, and if a settlement is convinced that the idea should be used to vindicate the law, and does not at the moment give its strength to denunciation, its attitude is at once taken to imply a championship of anarchy itself. The public mind at such a moment falls into the old medieval confusion. He who feeds or shelters a heretic is upon prima facie evidence a heretic himself. He who knows intimately people among whom anarchists arise is therefore an anarchist. I personally am convinced that anarchy as a philosophy is dying down, not only in Chicago, but everywhere, that their leading organs have discontinued publication, and that their most eminent men in America have deserted them. Even those groups which have continued to meet are dividing, and the major half in almost every instant calls itself Socialist Anarchists, an apparent contradiction of terms, whose members insist that the socialistic organisation of society must be the next stage of social development, and must be gone through with, so to speak, before the ideal state of society can be reached, so nearly begging the question that some unorthodox socialists are willing to recognise them. It is certainly true that just because anarchy questions the very foundations of society, the most elemental sense of protection demands that the methods of meeting the challenge should be intelligently considered. Whether or not Hull House has accomplished anything by its method of meeting such a situation, or at least attempting to treat it in a way which will not destroy confidence in the American institutions so adored by refugees from foreign governmental oppression, it is of course impossible for me to say. And yet it was in connection with an effort to pursue an intelligent policy in regard to so-called foreign anarchists that Hull House again became associated with that creed 6 years later. This again was an echo of the Russian Revolution, but in connection with one of its humblest representatives. A young Russian Jew named Averbuch appeared in the early morning at the house of the Chicago chief of police upon an obscure errand. It was a moment of panic everywhere in regard to anarchists because of a recent murder in Denver which had been charged to an Italian anarchist, and the chief of police, assuming that the dark young man standing in his hallway was an anarchist bent upon his assassination, hastily called for help. In a panic born of fear and self-defense, young Averbuch was shot to death. The members of the Russian Jewish colony on the west side of Chicago were thrown into a state of intense excitement as soon as the nationality of the young man became known. They were filled with dark forebodings from a swift precedence of what it would mean to them were the odium of anarchy rightly or wrongly attached to one of their members. It seemed to the residents of Hull House most important that every effort should be made to ascertain just what did happen, that every means of securing information should be exhausted before a final opinion should be formed, and this odium fastened upon a colony of law-abiding citizens. The police might be right or wrong in their assertion that the man was an anarchist. It was, to our minds, also most unfortunate that the Chicago police, in the determination to uncover an anarchistic plot, should have utilised the most drastic methods of search within the Russian Jewish colony, composed of families only too familiar with the methods of Russian police. Therefore, when the Chicago police ransacked all the printing offices they could locate in the colony, when they raided a restaurant which they regarded as suspicious because it had been supplying food at cost to the unemployed, when they searched through private houses for papers and photographs of revolutionaries, when they seized the library of the Edelstadt group and carried the books, including Shakespeare and Herbert Spencer, to the City Hall, when they arrested two friends of young Averbuch and kept them in the police station 48 hours, when they mercilessly sweated the sister Olga that she might be startled into a confession. All these things so poignantly reminded them of Russian methods that the indignation fed both old memory and bitter disappointment in America swept over the entire colony. The older men asked whether constitutional rights gave no guarantee against such violent aggression of police power, and the hot-headed younger ones cried out at once that the only way to deal with the police was to defy them, which was true of police the world over. It was said many times that those who are without influence and protection in a strange country fare exactly as hard as do the poor in Europe, that all the talk of guaranteed protection through political institutions is nonsense. Every settlement has classes in citizenship in which the principles of American institutions are expounded, and of these the community as a whole approves. But the settlements know better than anyone else that while these classes and lectures are useful, nothing can possibly give lessons in citizenship so effectively and make so clear the constitutional basis of a self-governing community as the current event itself. The treatment at a given moment of that foreign colony which feels itself outraged and misunderstood either makes its constitutional rights clear to it or forever confuses it on the subject. The only method by which a reasonable and loyal conception of government may be substituted for the one formed upon Russian experiences is that the actual experience of refugees with government in America shall gradually demonstrate what a very different thing government means here. Such an event as the Averbuch affair accords an unprecedented opportunity to make clear this difference and to demonstrate beyond the possibility of misunderstanding that the guarantee of constitutional rights implies that officialism shall be restrained and guarded at every point, that the official represents not the will of a small administrative body but the will of the entire people, and that methods therefore have been constituted by which official aggression may be restrained. The Averbuch incident gave an opportunity to demonstrate this to that very body of people who need it most, to those who have lived in Russia, where the autocratic officers represent autocratic power and where government is officialism. It seemed to the residents in the settlements, the nearest the Jewish Russian colony, that it was an obvious piece of public spirit to try out all the legal value involved, to insist that American institutions were stout enough to break down in times of stress and public panic. The belief of many Russians that the Averbuch incident would be made a prelude to the constant use of the extradition treaty for the sake of terrorizing revolutionists both at home and abroad received a certain corroboration when an attempt was made in 1908 to extradite a Russian revolutionist named Rudovitz, who was living in Chicago. The first hearing before a United States Commissioner gave a verdict favorable to the Russian government, although this was afterwards reversed by the Department of State in Washington. Partly to educate American sentiment, partly to express sympathy with the Russian refugees in their dire need, a series of public meetings was arranged in which the operations of the extradition treaty were discussed by many of us who had spoken at a meeting held in protest against its ratification 15 years before. It is impossible for anyone unacquainted with the Russian colony to realize the consternation produced by this attempted extradition. I acted as a treasurer of the fund collected to defray the expenses of halls and printing in the campaign against the policy of extradition, and had many opportunities to talk with members of the colony. One old man, tearing his hair and beard as he spoke, declared that all his sons and grandsons might thus be sent back to Russia. In fact, all the younger men in the colony might be extradited, for every high-spirited Russian was, in a sense, a revolutionist. Would it not provoke to ironic laughter that very nemesis which presides over the destinies of nations, if the most autocratic government yet remaining in civilization should succeed in utilizing for its own autocratic methods the youngest and most daring experiment in democratic government which the world has ever seen? Stranger results have followed a course of stupidity and injustice resulting from blindness and panic. It is certainly true that if the decision of the federal office in Chicago had not been reversed by the Department of State in Washington, the United States government would have been committed to return thousands of spirited young refugees to the punishments of Russian autocracy. It was perhaps significant of our need of what Napoleon called a revival of civil morals that the public appealed against such a reversal of our traditions had to be based largely upon the contributions to American progress made from other revolutionists. The Puritans from the English, Lafayette from the French, Karl Schurz and many another able man from the German upheavals in the middle of the century. A distinguished German scholar, writing at the end of his long life a description of his friends of 1848, who made a gallant although premature effort to unite the German states and to secure a constitutional government, thus concludes: "But not a few saw the whole of their lives wrecked, either in prison or poverty, though they had done no wrong, and in many cases were the finest characters it has been my good fortune to know. They were before their time, the fruit was not ripe as it was in 1871, and Germany lost her best sons in those miserable years." When the time is ripe in Russia, when she finally yields to those great forces which are moulding and renovating contemporary life, when her Cavour and her Bismarck finally throw into the first governmental forms all that yearning for juster human relations which the idealistic Russian revolutionists embody, we may look back upon these miserable years with a sense of chagrin at our lack of sympathy and understanding. Again, it is far from easy to comprehend the great Russian struggle. I recall a visit from the famous revolutionist Gershuni, who had escaped from Siberia in a barrel of cabbage rolled under the very fortress of the commandant himself, had made his way through Manchuria and China to San Francisco, and on his way back to Russia had stopped in Chicago for a few days. 3 months later we heard of his death, and whenever I recall the conversation held with him, I find it invested with that dignity which his last words imply. Upon the request of a comrade, Gershuni had repeated the substance of the famous speech he had made to the court which sentenced him to Siberia. As representing the government against which he had rebelled, he told the court that he might in time be able to forgive all of their outrages and injustices save one. The unforgivable outcry would remain that hundreds of men like himself, who were vegetarians because they were not willing to participate in the destruction of living creatures, who had never struck a child even in punishment, who were so consumed with tenderness for the outcast and oppressed that they lived for weeks among starving peasants only that they might cheer and solace them, that these men should have been driven into terrorism, until impelled to execute, as they call it, assassinate, the Anglo-Saxon would term it, public officials, was something for which he would never forgive the Russian government. It was perhaps the heat of argument as much as conviction which led me to reply that it would be equally difficult for society to forgive these very revolutionists for one thing they had done, their institution of the use of force in such wise that it would inevitably be imitated by men of less scruple and restraint, that to have revived such a method in civilization, to have justified it by their disinterestedness of purpose and nobility of character, was perhaps the gravest responsibility that any group of men could assume. With a smile of indulgent pity such as one might grant to a mistaken child, he replied that Tolstoyan principles were as fitted to Russians as these toilettes, pointing to the thin summer gowns of the listeners, were fitted to a Siberian winter. And yet I held the belief then, as I certainly do now, that when the sense of justice seeks to express itself quite outside the regular channels of established government, it has set forth on a dangerous journey, inevitably ending in disaster, and that this is true in spite of the fact that the adventure may have been inspired by noble motives. Still more perplexing than the use of force by the revolutionists is the employment of the agent provocateur on the part of the Russian government. The visit of Vladimir Burtsev to Chicago just after his exposure of the famous secret agent Azef filled one with perplexity in regard to a government which would connive to the violent death of a faithful official, and that a member of the royal household for the sake of bringing opprobrium and punishment to the revolutionists and credit to the secret police. The settlement has also suffered through its effort to secure open discussion of the methods of the Russian government. During the excitement connected with the visit of Gorky to this country, 3 different committees of Russians came to Hull House, begging that I would secure a statement in at least one of the Chicago dailies of their own view that the agents of the Khazar had cleverly centred public attention upon Gorky's private life and fomented a scandal so successfully that the object of Gorky's visit to America had been foiled. He who had known immediately the most wretched of the Khazar's subjects, who was best able to sympathetically portray their wretchedness, not only failed to get a hearing before an American audience, but could scarcely find the shelter of a roof. I told 2 of the Russian committees that it was hopeless to undertake any explanation of the bitter attack until public excitement had somewhat subsided. But one Sunday afternoon, when a 3rd committee arrived, I said that I would endeavour to have reprinted in a Chicago daily the few scattered articles written for the magazines which tried to explain the situation, one by the head professor in political economy of a leading university, and others by publicists well informed as to Russian affairs. I hoped that a cosmopolitan newspaper might feel an obligation to recognise the desire for fair play on the part of thousands of its readers among the Russians, Poles and Finns, at least to the extent of reproducing these magazine articles under a non-committal caption. That same Sunday evening, in company with one of the residents, I visited a newspaper office only to hear its representative say that my plan was quite out of the question, as the whole subject was what newspaper men called a sacred cow. He said, however, that he would willingly print an article which I myself should write and sign. I declined this offer with the statement that one who had my opportunities to see the struggles of poor women in securing support for their children found it impossible to write anything which would however remotely justify the loosening of marriage bonds, even if the defence of Gorky made by Russian committees was sound. We left the newspaper office somewhat discouraged with what we thought was one more unsuccessful effort to procure a hearing for the immigrants. I had considered the incident closed, when to my horror and surprise several months afterwards it was made the basis of a story with every possible vicious interpretation. One of the Chicago newspapers had been indicted by Mayor June for what he considered an actionable attack upon his appointees to the Chicago School Board, of whom I was one, and the incident, enlarged and coarsened, was submitted as evidence to the grand jury in regard to my views and influence. Although the evidence was thrown out, an attempt was made again to revive this story by the managers of Mayor June's second campaign, this time to show how the protector of the oppressed was traduced. The incident is related here as an example of the clever use of that old device which throws upon the radical in religion, in education and in social reform, the odium of encouraging harlots and sinners and of defending their doctrines. If the underdog were always right, one might easily try to defend him. The trouble is that very often he is but obscurely right, sometimes only partially right, and quite often wrong. But perhaps he is never so altogether wrong and pig-headed and utterly reprehensible as he is represented to be by those who add the possession of prejudices to the other most insuperable difficulties of understanding him. It was perhaps not surprising that with these excellent opportunities for misjudging Hull House, we should have suffered attack from time to time whenever any untoward event gave an opening, as when an Italian immigrant murdered a priest in Denver, Colorado. Although the wretched man had never been in Chicago, much less at Hull House, a Chicago ecclesiastic asserted that he had learned hatred of the church as a member of the Giordano Bruno Club, an Italian club, one of whose members lived at Hull House, and which had occasionally met there, although it had long maintained clubrooms of its own. This club had its origins in the old struggles of united Italy against the temporal power of the Pope, one of the European echoes with which Chicago resounds. The Italian resident, as the editor of a paper representing New Italy, had come in sharp conflict with the Chicago ecclesiastic, first in regard to naming a public school of the vicinity after Garibaldi, which was of course not tolerated by the church, and then in regard to many another issue arising in anti-clericalism, which, although a political party, is constantly involved from the very nature of the case in theological difficulties. The contest had been carried on with a bitterness impossible for an American to understand, but its origin and implications were so obvious that it did not occur to any of us that it would be associated with Hull House, either in its motive or direction. The ecclesiastic himself had lived for many years in Rome, and as I had often discussed the problem of Italian politics with him, I was quite sure he understood the raison d'etre for the Giordano Bruno Club. Fortunately, in the midst of the rhetorical attack, our friendly relations remained unbroken with the neighbouring priests, from whom we continued to receive uniform courtesy as we co-operated in cases of sorrow and need. Hundreds of devout communicants identified with the Hull House clubs and classes were deeply distressed by the incident, but assured us it was all a misunderstanding. Easter came soon afterwards, and it was not difficult to make a connection between the attack and the myriad of Easter cards which filled my mail. Thus a settlement becomes involved in the many difficulties of its neighbours, as its experiences make vivid the consciousness of modern internationalism. And yet the very fact that the sense of reality is so keen, and the obligation of the settlement so obvious, may perhaps in itself explain the opposition Hull House had encountered when it expressed its sympathy with the Russian Revolution. We were much entertained, and although somewhat ruefully, when a Chicago woman withdrew from us a large annual subscription because Hull House had defended a Russian refugee, while she, who had seen much of the Russian aristocracy in Europe, knew from them that all the revolutionary agitation was both unreasonable and unnecessary. It is of course impossible to say whether these oppositions were inevitable, or whether they were indications that Hull House had somehow bungled at its task. Many times I have been driven to the confession of the blundering Emile. It requires ability to make what we seem agree with what we are. End of chapter 17. Recording by Double Mirrors. Chapter 18 of 20 Years at Hull House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Double Mirrors. 20 Years at Hull House by Jane Addams. Chapter 18. Socialized Education. In a paper written years ago, I deplored at some length the fact that educational matters are more democratic in their political than in their social aspect, and I quote the following extract from it as throwing some light upon the earlier educational undertakings at Hull House. Teaching in a settlement requires distinct methods, for it is true of people who have been allowed to remain undeveloped and whose facilities are inert and sterile that they cannot take their learning heavily. It has to be diffused in a social atmosphere. Information must be held in solution in a medium of fellowship and goodwill. Intellectual life requires for its expansion and manifestation the influences and assimilations of the interests and affections of others. Mazzini, that greatest of all democrats, who broke his heart over the condition of the South European peasantry, said, "Education is not merely a necessity of true life, by which the individual reviews his vital force in the vital force of humanity. It is a holy communion with generations dead and living, by which he fecundates all his faculties. When he is withheld from this communion of generations, as the Italian peasant has been, we say, he is like a beast of the field, he must be controlled by force. Even to this it is sometimes added that it is absurd to educate him, immoral to disturb his content. We stupidly use the effect as an argument for a continuance of the cause. It is needless to say that a settlement is a protest against a restricted view of education." In line with this declaration, Hull House in the very beginning opened what we called college extension classes, with a faculty finally numbering 35 college men and women, many of whom held their pupils for consecutive years. As these classes attenuated in Chicago the university extension and normal extension classes, and supplied a demand for stimulating instruction, the attendants strained to their utmost capacity the spacious rooms in the old house. The relation of students and faculty to each other and to the residents was that of guest and hostess, and at the close of each term the residents gave a reception to students and faculty, which was one of the chief social events of the season. Upon this comfortable social basis, some very good work was done. In connection with these classes, a Hull House summer school was instituted at Rockford College, which was most generously placed at our disposal by the trustees. For 10 years 100 women gathered there for 6 weeks. In addition, there were always men on the faculty, and a group of young men among the students who were lodged in the gymnasium building. The outdoor classes in bird study and botany, the serious reading of literary masterpieces, the boat excursions on the Rock River, the cooperative spirit of doing the housework together, the satirical commencements in party-coloured caps and gowns, led themselves towards a reproduction of the comradeship which college life fosters. As each member of the faculty, as well as students, paid $3 a week, and as we had little outlay beyond the actual cost of food, we easily defrayed our expenses. The undertaking was so simple and gratifying in results that it might well be reproduced in many college buildings, which are set in the midst of beautiful surroundings, unused during the 2 months of the year when hundreds of people, able to pay only moderate price for lodgings in the country, can find nothing comfortable and no mental food more satisfying than piazza gossip. Every Thursday evening during the first years, a public lecture came to be an expected event in the neighbourhood, and Hull House became one of the early university extension centres, first in connection with an independent society and later with the University of Chicago. One of the Hull House trustees was so impressed with the value of this orderly and continuous presentation of economic subjects that he endowed 3 courses in a downtown centre, in which the lectures were free to anyone who chose to come. He was much pleased that these lectures were largely attended by working men, who ordinarily prefer that economic subject shall be presented by a partisan, and who are supremely indifferent to examinations and credits. They also dislike the balancing of pro and con, which scholarly instruction implies, and prefer to be inebriated on raw truth, rather than to sip a carefully prepared draught of knowledge. Nevertheless, Bowen Hall, which seats 750 people, is often none too large to hold the audiences of men who come to Hull House every Sunday evening during their winter, to attend the illustrated lectures provided by the faculty of the University of Chicago, and others who kindly give their services. These courses differ enormously in their popularity. One on European capitals and their social significance was followed with the most vivid attention, and sense of participation indicated by groans and hisses when the audience was reminded of an unforgettable feud between Austria and her Slavic subjects, or when they wildly applauded a Polish hero endeared through his tragic failure. In spite of the success of these Sunday evening courses, it has never been an easy undertaking to find suitable lectures. A course of lectures on astronomy illustrated by stereoptician slides will attract a large audience the first week, who hope to hear of the wonders of the heavens and the relation of our Earth thereto, but instead are treated to spectrum analysis of stardust or the latest theory concerning the Milky Way. The habit of research and the desire to say the latest word upon any subject often overcomes the sympathetic understanding of his audience which the lecturer might otherwise develop, and he insensibly drops into the dull terminology of the classroom. There are, of course, notable exceptions. We had 12 gloriously popular talks on organic evolution, but the lecturer was not yet a professor, merely a university instructor, and his mind was still eager over the marvel of it all. Fortunately, there is an increasing number of lectures whose matter is so real, so definite, and so valuable, that in an attempt to give it an exact equivalence in words, they utilize the most direct form of expression. It sometimes seems as if the men of substantial scholarship were content to leave to the charlatan the teaching of those things which deeply concern the welfare of mankind, and that the mass of men get their intellectual food from the outcasts of scholarship, who provide millions of books, pictures, and shows, not to instruct and guide, but for the sake of their own financial profit. A settlement soon discovers that simple people are interested in large and vital subjects, and the Hull House residents themselves, at one time with only partial success, undertook to give a series of lectures on the history of the world, beginning with the nebular hypothesis and reaching Chicago itself in the 25th lecture. Absurd as the hasty review appears, there is no doubt that the beginner in knowledge is always eager for the general statement, as those wise old teachers of the people who knew, when they put the history of creation on the stage and the monks themselves became the actors. I recall that in planning my first European journey, I had soberly hoped in 2 years to trace the entire pattern of human excellence as we passed from one country to another, and the shrines of popular affection had consecrated to the saints, in the frequented statues erected to heroes, and in the worn blazonry of funeral braziers. An illustration that when we are young, we all long for those mountain tops upon which we may soberly stand and dream of our own ethereal and uncertain attempts at righteousness. I have had many other illustrations of this. A statement was recently made to me by a member of Hull House Boys' Club, who had been unjustly arrested as an accomplice to a young thief and held in the police station for 3 days, that during his detention he had remembered the way Jean Villain behaved when he was everlastingly pursued by that policeman who was only trying to do right. I kept seeing the pictures in that illustrated lecture you gave about him, and I thought it would be queer if I couldn't behave well for 3 days when he had kept it up for years. The power of dramatic action may unfortunately be illustrated in other ways. During the weeks when all the daily newspapers were full of the details of a notorious murder trial in New York and all the hideous events which preceded the crime, one evening I saw in the street a knot of working girls leaning over a newspaper, admiring the clothes, the beauty, and the sorrowful expression of the unhappy heroine. In the midst of the trial, a woman who I had known for years came to talk to me about her daughter, shamefacedly confessing that the girl was trying to dress and look like the notorious girl in New York, and that she had even said to her mother in a moment of defiance, "Some day I shall be taken into court, and then I shall dress just as Evelyn did, and face my accusers as she did in innocence and beauty." If one makes calls on a Sunday afternoon in the homes of the immigrants' colonies near Hull House, one finds the family absorbed in the Sunday edition of a sensational daily newspaper. Even those who cannot read quite easily follow the comic adventures portrayed in the colourful pictures of the supplement, or tracing the clue of a murder carefully depicted by a black line drawn through a plan of houses and streets. Sometimes lessons in the great loyalties and group affections come through life itself, and yet in such a manner that one cannot but deplore it. During the Teamsters strike in Chicago several years ago, when class bitterness rose to a dramatic climax, I remember going to visit a neighborhood boy who had been severely injured when he had taken the place of a union driver upon a coal wagon. As I approached the house in which he lived, a large group of boys and girls, some of them very little children, surrounded me to convey the exciting information that Jack T. was a scab and that I couldn't go in there. I explained to the excited children that his mother, who was a friend of mine, was in trouble, quite irrespective of the way her boy had been hurt. The crowd around me outside of the house of the scab constantly grew larger, and I, finally abandoning my attempt at explanation, walked in only to have the mother say, "Please don't come here, you will only get hurt too." Of course I did not get hurt, but the episode left upon my mind one of the most painful impressions I have ever received in connection with the children of the neighborhood. In addition to all else are the lessons of loyalty and comradeship to come to them as the mere reversal of class antagonism, and yet it was but a trifling incident out of the great general spirit of bitterness and strife which filled the city. Therefore the residents of Hull House place increasing emphasis upon the great inspirations and solaces of literature and are unwilling that it should ever languish as a subject for class instruction or for reading parties. The Shakespeare Club has lived a continuous existence at Hull House for 16 years, during which time its members have heard the leading interpreters of Shakespeare, both among scholars and players. I recall that one of its earliest members said that her mind was peopled with Shakespeare characters during her long hours of sewing in a shop, that she couldn't remember what she thought about before she joined the club, and concluded that she hadn't thought about anything at all. To feed the mind of the worker, to lift it above the monotony of his task, and to connect it with the larger world outside of his immediate surroundings, has always been the object of art, perhaps never more nobly fulfilled than by the great English bard. Miss Starr has held classes in Dante and Browning for many years, and the great lines are conned with never-failing enthusiasm. I recall Miss Lathrop's Plato Club and an audience who listened to a series of lectures by Dr. John Dewey on social psychology, as genuine intellectual groups consisted largely of people from the immediate neighbourhood who were willing to make that effort from which we all shrink, the effort of thought. But while we prize these classes as we do, the help we are able to give to the exceptional young man or woman who reaches the college and university and leaves the neighbourhood of his childhood behind him, the residents of Hull House feel increasingly that the educational efforts of a settlement should not be directed primarily to reproduce the college type of culture, but to work out a method and an ideal adapted to the immediate situation. They feel that they should promote a culture which will not set its possessor aside in a class with others like himself, but which will, on the contrary, connect him with all sorts of people by his ability to understand them as well as his power to supplement their present surroundings with a historic background. Among the hundreds of immigrants who have for years attended classes at Hull House designed primarily to teach the English language, dozens of them have struggled to express in the newly acquired tongue some of those hopes and longings which had so much to do with their emigration. A series of plays was thus written by a young bohemian, essays by a Russian youth, outpouring sorrows rivaling Werther himself, and yet containing the precious stuff of youth's perennial revolt against accepted wrongs. Stories of Russian oppression and petty injustices, throughout which the desire for free America became a crystallized hope. An attempt to portray the Jewish Day of Atonement in such wise that even individualistic Americans may catch a glimpse of that deeper national life which has survived all transplanting and expresses itself in forms so ancient that they appear grotesque to the ignorant spectator. I remember a pathetic effort on the part of a young Russian Jewess to describe the vivid inner life of an old Talmud scholar, probably her uncle or father, as one of persistently occupied with the grave and important things of the spirit, although when brought into sharp contact with busy and overworked people, he inevitably appeared self-absorbed and slothful. Certainly no one who had read her paper could again see such an old man in his praying shawl bent over his crabbed book without a sense of understanding. On the other hand, one of the most pitiful periods in the drama of the much-praised youth American who attempts to rise in life is the time when his educational requirements seem to have locked him up and made him rigid. He fancies himself shut off from his uneducated family and misunderstood by his friends. He is bowed down by his mental accumulations and often gets no farther than to carry them through life as a great burden, and not once does he obtain a glimpse of the delights of knowledge. The teacher in a settlement is constantly put upon his mettle to discover methods of instruction which shall make knowledge quickly available to his pupils, and I should like to here pay my tribute of admiration to the Dean of our Educational Department, Miss Landsberg, and to the many men and women who every winter come regularly to Hull House, putting untiring effort into the endless task of teaching the newly arrived immigrant the first use of a language of which he has been in desperate need. Even a meagre knowledge of English may mean an opportunity to work in a factory versus non-employment, or it may mean a question of life or death when a sharp command must be understood in order to avoid the danger of a descending crane. In response to demand for an education which should be immediately available, classes have been established and grown apace in cooking, dressmaking and millinery. A girl who attends them will often say that she expects to marry a working man next spring, and because she has worked in a factory so long, she knows little about a house. Sometimes classes are composed of young matrons of like factory experiences. I recall one of them whose husband had become so desperate after 2 years of her unskilled cooking that he had threatened to desert her and go where he could get decent food, as she confided to me in a tearful interview, when she followed my advice to take the Hull House courses in cooking, and at the end of 6 months reported a united and happy home. 2 distinct trends are found in response to these classes. The first is for domestic training, and the other is for trade teaching, which shall enable the poor little milliner and dressmaker apprentices to shorten the years of errand running, which is supposed to make them teach their trade. The beginning of trade instruction has been already evolved in connection with the Hull House Boys Club. The ample Boys Club building presented to Hull House 3 years ago by one of our trustees has afforded well-equipped shops for work in wood, iron and brass, for smithing in copper and tin, for commercial photography, for printing, for telegraphy, and electrical construction. These shops have been filled with boys who are eager for that which seems to give them a clue to the industrial life all about them. These classes meet twice a week and are taught by intelligent working men who apparently give the boys what they want better than do the strictly professional teachers. While these classes in no sense provide a trade training, they often enable a boy to discover his aptitude and help him in the selection of what he wants to be by reducing the trades to embryonic forms. The factories are so complicated that the boy brought in contact with them, unless he has some preliminary preparation, is apt to become confused. In pedagogical terms, he loses his power of orderly reaction and is often so discouraged or so overstimulated in his very first years of factory life that his future usefulness is seriously impaired. One of Chicago's most significant experiments in the direction of correlating the schools with actual industry was for several years carried out in a public school building situated near Hull House, in which the bricklayers' apprentices were taught 8 hours a day in special classes during the non-bricklaying season. This early public school venture anticipated the very successful arrangement later carried on in Cincinnati, in Pittsburgh and in Chicago itself, whereby a group of boys that work in a factory alternate month by month with another group who are in school and are thus intelligently conducted into the complicated process of modern industry. But for a certain type of boy who has been demoralized by the constant change and excitement of street life, even these apprenticeship classes are too strenuous, and he has to be lured into the path of knowledge by all sorts of appeals. It sometimes happens that boys are held in the Hull House classes for weeks by their desire for the excitement of placing burglar alarms under the doormats. But to enable the professor of even a little knowledge to thus play with it, is to decoy his feet at least through the first steps of the long, hard road of learning, although even in this the teacher must proceed warily. A typical street boy who was utterly absorbed in a wood carving class abruptly left never to return when he was told to use some simple calculations in the laying out of the points. He evidently scented the approach of his old enemy, arithmetic, and fled the field. On the other hand, we have come across many cases in which boys have vainly tried to secure such opportunities for themselves. During the trial of a boy of 10, recently arrested for truancy, it developed that he had spent many long hours watching the electrical construction in a downtown building, and many others in the public library, reading about electricity. Another boy who was taken from school early when his father lost both of his legs in a factory accident tried in vain to find a place for himself with machinery. He was declared too small for any such position, and for 4 years worked as an errand boy, during which time he steadily turned in his unopened pay envelope for the use of the household. At the end of the 4th year, the boy disappeared, to the great distress of his invalid father and his poor mother, whose day washings became the sole support of the family. He had beaten his way to Kansas City, hoping that they wouldn't be so particular there about a fellow's size. He came back at the end of 6 weeks, because he felt sorry for his mother who, aroused at last to a realization of his unbending purpose, applied for help to the Juvenile Protection Association. They found a position for the boy in a machine shop, and an opportunity for evening classes. Out of the 1,500 members of Hull House Boys' Club, hundreds seemed to respond only to the opportunities for recreation, and many of the older ones apparently cared only for the bowling and the billiards. And yet tournaments and match games under supervision and regulated hours are a great advance over the sensual and exhausting pleasures to be found so easily outside the club. These organised sports readily connect themselves with the Hull House Gymnasium and with all these enthusiasms which are so mysteriously aroused by athletics. Our gymnasium has been filled with large and enthusiastic classes for 18 years in spite of the popularity of dancing and other possible substitutes, while the Saturday evening athletic contests have become a feature of the neighbourhood. The settlement strives for that type of gymnastics which is at least partly a matter of character, for that training which presupposes abstinence and the curbing of impulse, as well as for those athletic contests in which the mind of the contestant must be vigilant to keep the body closely to the rules of the game. As one sees in rhythmic motion the slim bodies of a class of lads, that scrupulous and uncontaminate purity of form which recommended itself even to the Greeks as befitting messengers from the gods, if such messengers should come. One offers up an awkward prosaic from the very essence of that old prayer, grant them with feet so light to pass through life. But while the glory stored up for Olympian winners was at the most a handful of parsley, an ode, fame for family and city, on the other hand, when the men and boys from the Hull House Gymnasium bring back their cups and medals, one's mind is filled with something like foreboding, and the reflection that too many successes may lead the winners into the professionalism which is so associated with betting and so close to pugilism. Candour, however, compels me to state that a long acquaintance with the acrobatic folk who have to do with the circus, a large number of whom practice in our gymnasium every winter, has raised our estimate of that profession. Young people who work long hours at sedentary occupations, factories and offices, need perhaps more than anything else the freedom and ease to be acquired from a symmetrical muscular development, and are quick to respond to that fellowship which athletics apparently affords more easily than anything else. The Greek immigrants from large classes are eager to reproduce the remnants of old methods of wrestling and other bits of classic lore which they still possess, and when one of the Greeks won a medal in a wrestling match which represented the championship of the entire city, it was quite impossible that he should present it at the Hull House trophy chest without a classic phrase which he recited most gravely and charmingly. It was in connection with a large association of Greek lads that Hull House finally lifted its long restriction against military drill. If athletic contests are the residuum of warfare, first waged against the conqueror without and then against the tyrants within the state, the modern Greek youth is still in the first stage so far as his inherited attitude against the Turk is concerned. Each lad believes that at any moment he may be called home to fight this long-time enemy of Greece. With such a genuine motive at hand, it seemed mere affectation to deny the use of our boys' club building and gymnasium for organised drill, although happily it forms but a small part of the activities of the Greek Educational Association. Having thus confessed to military drill, countenanced if not encouraged at Hull House, it is perhaps only fair to relate an early experience of mine with the Columbian Guards and organisation of the World's Fair summer. Although the Hull House squad was organised as the others were with the motto of a clean city, it was very anxious for military drill. This request not only shocked my non-resistant principles, but seemed to afford an opportunity to find a substitute for the military tactics which were used in the boys' brigades everywhere, even in those connected with churches. At the cleaning of the filthy streets and alleys was the obstinate purpose of the Columbian Guards. I suggested to the boys that we work out a drill with sewer spades, which with their long narrow blades and shortened handles were not so unlike bayoneted guns in size, weight and general appearance, but that much of the usual military drill could be readapted. While I myself was present at the gymnasium to explain that it was nobler to drill in imitation of removing disease-breeding filth than to drill in simulation of warfare, while I distractedly readapted tales of chivalry to this modern rescuing of the endangered and distressed, the new drill went forward in some sort of fashion, but so surely as I withdrew, drill master would complain that our troops would first grow self-conscious, then demoralised, and finally flatly refuse to go on. Throughout the years since the failure of this quixotic experiment, I occasionally find one of these sewer spades in a Hull House storeroom, too truncated to be used for its original purpose, and too prosaic to serve the purpose for which it was bought. I can only look at it in the forlorn hope that it may foreshadow that piping time when the weapons of warfare shall be turned into the implements of civic salvation. Before closing this chapter on socialized education, it is only fair to speak of the education occurring to the Hull House residents themselves during their years of living in what at least purports to be a centre for social and educational activity. While a certain number of residents are primarily interested in charitable administration and the amelioration which can be suggested only by those who know actual conditions, there are other residents identified with the house from its earlier years to whom the group of immigrants make the historical appeal, and who use not only their linguistic ability but all the resource they can command of travel and reading to qualify themselves for intelligent living in the immigrant quarter of the city. I remember one resident lately returned from a visit in Sicily who was able to interpret to a bewildered judge the ancient privilege of a jilted lover to scratch the cheek of his faithless sweetheart with the edge of a coin. Although the custom in America has degenerated into a knife slashing after the manner of foreign customs here, and although this Sicilian deserved punishment, the incident was yet lifted out of the slough of mere brutal assault, and the interpretation won the gratitude of many Sicilians. There is no doubt that residents in a settlement too often move towards their ends with hurried and ignoble gait, putting forth thorns in their eagerness to bear grapes. It is always easy for those in pursuit of ends which they consider of overwhelming importance to become themselves thin and impoverished in spirit, and to gradually develop a dark mistaken eagerness alternating with fatigue, which supersedes the great and gracious ways so much more than congruous with worthy aims. Partly because of this universal tendency, partly because a settlement shares the perplexities of its times and is never too dogmatic concerning the final truth, the residents would be glad to make the daily life of the settlement conform to every shape and mode of excellence. It may not be true that the good are always the merry, save by an evil chance, but a settlement would make clear that one need not be heartless and flippant in order to be merry, nor solemn in order to be wise. Therefore, quite as Hull House tries to redeem billiard tables from the association of gambling, and dancing from the temptations of the public dance halls, so it would associate with a life of upright purpose those more engaging qualities which in the experience of the neighbourhood are too often connected with dubious aims. Throughout the history of Hull House, many inquiries have been made concerning the religion of the residents, and the reply that they are as diversified in belief and in the ardour of the inner life as like any number of people in a college or similar group, apparently does not carry conviction. I recall that after a house for men residence had been opened on Polk Street, and the residential force at Hull House numbered 20, we made an effort to come together on Sunday evenings in a household service, hoping thus to express our moral unity in spite of the fact that we represented many creeds. But although all of us reverently knelt when the High Church resident read the evening service, and bowed our heads when the evangelical resident led in prayer after his chapter, and although we sat respectfully through the twilight when a resident read her favourite passages from Plato and another from Abt Vogler, we concluded at the end of the winter that this was not religious fellowship, and that we did not care for another reading club. So it was reluctantly given up, and we found that it was quite as necessary to come together on the basis of the deed in our common aim inside the house as it was in the neighbourhood itself. I once had a conversation on the subject with the warden of Oxford House, who kindly invited me to the evening service held for the residents in the little chapel on the top floor of the settlement. All the residents were high churchmen, to whom the service was important and reverent part of their day. Upon my reply to a query of the warden that the residents of Hull House could not come together for religious worship because there were among us Jews, Roman Catholics, English churchmen, dissenters and a few agnostics, and that we had found unsatisfactory the diluted form of worship which we could carry on together, he replied that it must be most difficult to work in a group so diversified, for he depended upon the evening service to clear away any difficulties which the day had involved, and to bring the residents to a religious consciousness of their common aim. I replied that the diversity of creed was part of the situation in American settlements, as it was our task to live in a neighbourhood of many nationalities and faiths, and that it might be possible that among such diversified group it was better than the settlement corps should also represent varying beliefs. A wise man has told us that men are once for all so made that they prefer a rational world to believe in and to live in, but that is no easy matter to find a world rational as to its intellectual, aesthetic, moral and practical aspects. Certainly it is no matter if the place selected is the very sort where the four aspects are apparently furthest from perfection, but an undertaking resembling this is what the settlement gradually becomes committed to, as its function is revealed through the reaction on its consciousness of its own experiences. Because of this fourfold undertaking, the settlement has gathered into residence people of widely diversified tastes and interests, and in Hull House at least the group has been surprisingly permanent. The majority of the present corp of 40 residents support themselves by their business and professional occupations in the city, giving only their leisure time to settlement undertakings. This in itself tends to continuity of residence and has certain advantages. Among the present staff, of whom the larger number have been in residence for more than 12 years, there are the secretary of the City Club, 2 practising physicians, several attorneys, newspapermen, businessmen, teachers, scientists, artists, musicians, lecturers in the School of Civics and Philanthropy, officers in the Juvenile Protective Association, and in the League for the Protection of Immigrants, a visiting nurse, a sanitary inspector, and others. We have also worked out during our years of residence a plan of living which may be called cooperative, for the families and individuals who rent the Hull House apartments have the use of the central kitchen and dining room so far as they care for them. Many of them work for hours every week in the studios and shops. The theatre and the drawing rooms are available for such organisation as they care to form. The entire group of 13 buildings is heated and lighted from a central plant. During the years the common human experience have gathered about the house. Funeral services have been held there, marriages and christenings, and many memories hold us to each other as well as to our neighbours. Each resident, of course, carefully defrays his own expenses, and his relations to his fellow residents are not unlike those of a college professor to his colleagues. The depth and strength of his relation to the neighbourhood must depend very largely upon himself and upon the genuine friendships that he has been able to make. His relation to the city as a whole comes largely through his identification with those groups who are carrying forward the reforms which a settlement neighbourhood so sadly needs and with which residence has made him familiar. Life in the settlement discovers, above all, what has been called the extraordinary pliability of human nature, and it seems impossible to set any bounds to the moral capabilities which might unfold under ideal civic and educational conditions. But in order to obtain these conditions, the settlement recognises the need of cooperation, both with the radical and the conservative, and from the very nature of the case, the settlement cannot limit its friends to any one political party or economic group. The settlement casts aside none of those things which cultivated men have come to consider reasonable and goodly, but it insists that those belong as well to that great body of people who, because of toilsome and underpaid labour, are unable to procure them for themselves. Added to this is a profound conviction that the common stock of intellectual enjoyment should not be difficult to assess because of the economic position of him who would support it, that those best results of civilization upon which depend the finer and freer aspects of living must be incorporated into our common life and have free mobility through all elements of society if we would have our democracy endure. The educational activities of a settlement, as well as its philanthropic, civil and social undertakings, are but differing manifestations of the attempt to socialize democracy, as is the very existence of the settlement itself. End of chapter 18. Recording by Double Mirrors. End of 20 Years at Hull House by Jane Addams.